The story began with the main character having an exceptional talent for wielding a sword. There was nothing he couldn't learn, and nothing that could escape his blade. He worked so hard that his palms were stained with blood. After dropping out of school, he spent 20 years honing and perfecting his knife skills. So much so that he became the best swordsman in the country. At that moment, in one of the restaurants in his city, the waiters were shouting that table 3 needed an A-series omakase. The staff were greeting new guests. The customers were admiring how delicious the food looked. They were shouting that the chef was very good with a knife. The staff were saying goodbye to their departing customers. At that moment, a strange sound was heard in the kitchen, which was rhythmically repeated. Everyone started looking for the source of the annoying sound and looked around. At that moment, Kim was cutting fish with his knife. He was standing there with his headphones on and was completely focused on his work. One of the workers addressed him as the boss and said that he apologized to him, but his phone kept ringing. He took off his earphone and realized that he was called. He thought that he had set it to silent. He took out his phone, and there were notifications from an old game. The Holy Protector wrote that he was a hero, and the invasion of the Demon King's army into the academy was not over yet. He thought, didn't he delete that game? Is the game broken? One of the waiters came up to him and said that a guest had arrived. He said with a tired face that they should inform him that he was not there. At that moment, he put his phone in his pocket, which continued to ring with notifications. The waiter told the guest with a guilty voice that he was busy now, they should reschedule it for another time. The boss came into the kitchen, who said that nothing of the sort, just let them stop lying to him. The protagonist looked at him. The boss walked in with his guards and greeted the chief, hiding his smile. He said that he thought it was time to answer the question. He came to hear his answer. He gave him enough time to think. Kim looked at him and said nothing. He said that it was not a difficult request for someone who held a sword in his hands every day. He also realized that he was too cold-blooded. He ordered the guards to show him the suitcase. The boss said that the customer must first show his sincerity. He would try not to disappoint him. A suitcase full of banknotes opened in front of the protagonist. The boss smiled and said that this was an additional fee of 300 million. If he did everything beautifully. At that moment, Kim threw a fish and coolly cut it in the air with his sharp knife. He got scared and realized that his interlocutor was not in the mood. He said that this was a kitchen and there was no place for dirt. This was no place for dirt like him. He asked him to leave right now. The boss got angry and shouted that he really is a holy sword. As expected, he is not someone who just chops fish. Let him show it. The protagonist grabbed his knife, and they took it as a threat. After that, the boss started to walk away and laugh. He looked back and said that he shouldn't think that he will stop there. He will come again soon. He told his guards that they need to get out of there already. One of the chefs stood not far from his boss and was awkwardly silent. After a while, Kim stood with the chef behind the building and smoked. The chef said that the final price was 300 million won. If he were him, he would accept the deal. Why did he refuse? The man lit a cigarette and said that all his life he has only cut fish heads. What does he even know about murder? The chef asked, so he is just using his reputation as a swordsman? Is he really going to slit someone's throat? He could just scare them to get money, then he could buy a house and open his own store. He also needed to live like a human. The protagonist told him that even if he offered him billions, he would refuse. He smiled and asked, what kind of notification was this? Was he dating someone? He started taking out his phone and asked, was he dating someone? It was just a game. He asked, was he still playing? Holy protection, or something like that. He answered that he was, but he had already stopped playing it. At that moment, the management came to the establishment. They shouted, why was the kitchen out of order? Where did they go without cleaning up? The cook started to panic and asked, were there management here? Then he went away so as not to anger them. Kim continued to smoke and said nothing. He thought that it was certain, when he was younger, his family went bankrupt, and from that moment on, he started working. Live like a human? It seemed that he was too fixated on making money. He took his phone out of his pocket and thought, why does it keep ringing? It's getting annoying. He asked, did he reinstall it after drinking? He thinks he needs to uninstall it again. Then he thought, these guys have been invading the kingdom for years. He tapped on that notification and realized that he didn't want to do that. The phone started glowing and a sound started coming out of the phone. He said hatefully that he tapped there. A message appeared on the screen asking him to tap the screen again. He thought that even after all this time, they still left the old soundtrack. He looked closely and said that the female characters were also very beautiful. At that moment, his phone started lagging really badly. The main character didn't understand anything at all. The phone screen started glowing really brightly and he was in complete shock. A few minutes later, that chef came out on the street again and said that his boss was calling him. He didn't see his boss, only the glowing phone was left in his place. He panicked and asked, where did it go? Why did he leave his phone? His boss started yelling from the room, so the kitchen doesn't know where their boss went. The cook decided to joke and said, laughing, that he probably went to take a shit. The boss yelled at them to tell him to hurry up and do it. The cook left, and the phone was left lying on the ground. There was a lot of static on the phone screen, and there was also a message and a loading screen. The transfer is 100% complete. About some time ago, Kim thought that he really didn't have much to talk about. This game is a typical donation model with a standard system auto search. An ordinary mass game that does not require any explanation. Why did he even download this game? Of course, it's all because of the drawing of the female characters. He was absorbed in this game, and the irony is that he spent a fortune on it, and also went through several cycles, and now he is not even a playable character. He is not even an NPC. A character whose whereabouts are unknown. A secondary character. He possessed this character. His name is Kama there. He was standing in front of the entrance to the rail wagon, but he was pushed by a girl who was coming out of it. He was surprised and thought, she is a girl? He understands what he thought, but it is not like that. He asked her, embarrassed, is she okay? She turned to him and apologized to him. He thought that in any case, fortunately, the action of divine protection of M takes place in Korea. He entered the rail wagon and grabbed the handrail. He thought they had used everything, names, locations, arrangements. The loudspeaker in the car sounded that the next station is Mapo Station. He looked around and thought that there were slight discrepancies in some things, but otherwise everything is the same. So he was able to adapt pretty quickly. He passed through the turnstile, which indicated that this is a teenager's ID. He thought that this had been happening for a year. He lived there, forgetting whether this is a game or reality. There was a life that he didn't have in the real world until this day came. The protagonist came to his house and said that he was back. His father said that he had finally come. His mother screamed that he was their pride, their great master of the blade. She asked him to wait. She was holding a notification letter in her hands, which said that their son was enrolled in the academy for the year 2034. They needed to attend several events and collect the necessary items. He should have his personal weapon and the supplies of their academy with him. Kama asked them if they could put it away. His father screamed, what is he talking about? He is very proud and will show it again and again. His mother screamed that they raised their child well. He screamed with joy to his wife that their son would already be at the entrance ceremony tomorrow. She asked if he had collected everything for the ceremony. He felt awkward and said that he would go and check it out. They agreed with him and continued screaming with joy. He thought that everything was exactly like that. His modest dream of a normal, quiet life had been shattered. He sat in front of his workplace, on which lay this piece of paper. He said that this event was tomorrow. When they were so happy, he could not refuse. He asked several times if he could not go, but no one cared. He looked at the picture and said that he was very tired. After that, he thought, what a bastard, how did he even get accepted into this prestigious school? The situation developed something like this. He remembered when his parents told him that last year your divine power manifested itself, and he immediately passed the entrance exam. Did he really forget? He was very surprised at that time. He thought that before he mastered this character, his divine power manifested itself, and he immediately passed the entrance exam to the Joaquin Academy. He looked closely at the paper and said, what is he, a genius? He is terrible. He thought that divine power is a special ability that people can use. It is somewhat similar to skills in a game. However, not everyone has special abilities. Divine power is genetically determined. Depending on the presence or absence of divine power, society is divided into 3 factions: the nobility, the middle class, and the poor. The Joaquin Academy is an educational institution created to maintain the power of the established elite class. Although the original pretext for building the academy was to raise a hero, it has long since become an educational institution for children from upper-class families. Recently, A special admission system was introduced for families that are not heroes. Special admissions committees. And he, was accepted as one of these special students. But why are heroes needed? It's quite simple, the Demon King is to blame. He repeated that this is not reality. An organization that trains heroes for war? Is this an army? It probably isn't, but if he were to serve again, that's how he would feel. He leaned on a chair and said, "Divine power?" A system window popped up in front of him, that his divine power was painlessness, which reduces pain. Its duration is 30 seconds, and the recharge is 12 hours. He was a little scared and said that he still can't get used to the status window. And what kind of ability did this character get? A terrible divine power painlessness. He thought, how could he pass with such crap? Every time he looked at it, he wanted to hit the wall. He cursed and asked, for the sake of 30 seconds, wait 12 hours? He saw something and said that he received a divine power when he took possession of this body. Blessing of the Sword God. Another system window popped up, that this skill will allow the hero to inflict additional cuts if he attacks the enemy. The duration is infinite, there is no recharge. This is activated when using a sword less than 30 centimeters in length, and less than millimeters in width. He looked at it, and said that the blessing of a god with his name. Are they kidding me? After all, his name is translated as Blood Demon. He thought that he had never seen this divine power in the game. Such a well-thought-out name sharply contrasts with the overly simple effect. Additional cuts upon damage? It was somehow absurd to write about such an obvious feature of divine power, completely out of place. But what was even more absurd was the activation condition, a sword 30 centimeters long or less than 5 centimeters wide. That was exactly the size of a sashimi knife. Was this perhaps a hint that he would have to make sashimi there too? He was disappointed in his skill and said that he didn't even know. Afterwards, he thought that life doesn't always go the way you want it to. He was still sitting on the chair, half reclining, and asked if he had brought everything. He had forgotten his equipment, that was for sure. He thought that now that he thought about it, his character's weapons. Even the lowest E-rank weapons cost tens of millions of won. An average C-rank would cost hundreds of millions. And A-rank and Y-rank items were real treasures. The protagonist thought about it, and said that the training fee alone was prohibitive. He didn't really want to shell out for something he was being dragged into. He thought that the letter said that he needed equipment, and if he didn't bring anything with him, he would make a bad impression on the first day. He said that he should take a walk to Dano, a large chain store then. He thought that he remembered his first master who insisted on using a Japanese sashimi knife worth over 100 million won. He said with a confident face that, and that he suddenly thought of that old man. He thought that a true master would never blame his tool. After a while, the protagonist stood in front of a senior. The senior said that he should let the incoming students come to him. Kama laid out his weapon and looked at it questioningly. The senior asked, "Is this his weapon, really?" He agreed with him, and waited for his decision. They both stood there in silence. Kama thought that on the day of the entrance ceremony, there is often an equipment inspection. Every year, the seniors throw away some tricks. They should be put back in place from the beginning. The high school student slammed his hand on the table and shouted that maybe the academy was a joke for him. He thought it was acceptable to use a kitchen knife in the entrance exam? The protagonist looked at him with disgust and said that it was his weapon. At first, he remained silent, but then he shouted at him in anger. He decided to calm him down, saying that he was a special student from a common family. The tuition fee alone was a huge burden for his parents. So how could he ask them for an expensive weapon as well? The high school student thought that the color of his badge meant he was a special student. Tuition fees for students from middle-class families were really a heavy burden. He was simply shocked that a person working in an institution that was supposed to promote equal rights to education could be so biased towards a kind and caring student. So he got a 30% discount. Kama told him with an angry face that humiliating weapons was the work of an amateur. He thought that a true master would never blame his tool. This is definitely not something a young guy should say. It seems like he has reached the top in some areas at his age. How eloquent he is! This indomitable spirit! God, this is amazing! One of the seniors said that the instructor was wrong. Cadet Kama's weapon was approved for use. The protagonist put his weapon in his backpack and thanked everyone. The other cadets began to discuss this. A female cadet asked with disdain, "A student with special clearance?" Another cadet asked how someone like him got there. Another cadet said that there was some special smell there. The senior student got angry and shouted for all the newcomers to shut up right now. As soon as the equipment evaluation is over, they need to get up and get out of there. Kama left in the noise with an awkward face. The high school student shouted that depending on his behavior, he could be all sweet and cuddly with them, or he would make them suffer. Did they understand that? The protagonist thought that he was, of course, thanking him for his post-traumatic stress disorder. After a while, he was sitting on a bench near the academy and said that he needed to take a break. He had expected something like that, of course, but he still felt uneasy. However, his equipment had been checked and he had survived the entrance ceremony. All that was left was the class placement exam, and of course, he was tired. He rubbed his face with his hands and said that he had actually gotten in. He thought that he would be spending the next 3 years at this school. This was the hero training school, the Joaquin Academy. He said that he had imagined it a little differently. It might be a bit of a stretch, but it was some kind of small town. It impressed him. He comfortably lounged on the bench and thought that he needed to attend a school meant for the upper classes. When he thought back to the time when he had to drop out of high school because of his family, it all seemed so surreal. The loudspeaker announced that the class entrance exam was about to begin. They were asking them to gather, the students, in the training hall at 1 o'clock. He rummaged through his bag and asked, were they gathering them already? The entrance ceremony was over, but the entrance exam was more important. He took out his knife and said that an exam was an exam, he had to go through this too. He thought that if he thought about it like that, he hadn't used a knife since he got there. There was no need. He remembered his master's words back then. He had said that he shouldn't leave his knife aside even for a day. Even at night, when he slept, let him keep it in his hand. He thought that it seemed like he had picked up another of his habits. He held the knife in his hands and said that for 20 years he hadn't let go of the knife. Had his skills become dull in a year? He started looking at his weapon, then he unpacked it and said that the knife was better than he thought. Now he needs to see if he can cut a leaf or two. After he unpacked the weapon, a system window popped up in front of him. His weapon meets the activation conditions. The blessing of the sword god is activated. The sword began to sparkle with magical energy. Another system window popped up about the danger that his level of physical fitness, his body is too low. His weapon level is too low. Let him use suppression to initiate synchronization with the user. He began to feel wild pain and thought. He just pulled out the knife, and the blessing was activated. A system window popped up that the synchronization is complete. May the blessing of the gods be with him. He began to hold the knife with his other hand. He could not understand why he felt such severe pain. He screamed in pain that if this did not end now, he would simply die. At that moment, the whole world cracked. He was left hanging in the air, and around him were fragments of that world and lightning from the knife. He looked at all this and just cursed. The protagonist decided to let go of the knife and asked what was happening to him. The knife fell to the ground of that space. After that, all the fragments of the world merged into one whole. He thought he came back? When he let go of the knife, he returned to normal. He grabbed his head in wild pain and screamed that his body hurt so much. He thought he understood the part where the divine power was activated. But could it be that the world falling apart like this has something to do with the blessing of the sword god? And this backlash causes too much pain. The divine power of painlessness can only deal with mild muscle pain. He looked at his trembling hand and thought that if every activation was like this, then he would not be able to use it. The loudspeaker announced that the students should immediately gather in the training hall. The protagonist silently looked at his knife, which was lying on the ground. He angrily asked, "What is this? Should he probably take it away? He can't leave the sashimi knife like this, and maybe he can. It's only the first time it hurts so much." He began to reach for his weapon with trembling hands and asked, "Will he be okay, right?" He grabbed his weapon again and screamed very loudly in pain. The people who were near him most likely thought that he had gone crazy. He began to curse and swear very loudly. After a while, in the training hall, all the students of this and the academy gathered there. There were many teachers who were having small talk. There were also parents of these students, who were also having interesting conversations. One of the parents said that he was also interested in how much their child's admissions cost. Suddenly, he noticed that a hero of the 7 stars, Kling Siegfried von Nibelung, was sitting not far from them. He turned to him and said that he had come a long way. Someone started shouting that he was a descendant of Aaron Nibelung, a student of the founder of the academy, Valor Joaquin, himself. Siegfried remained silent and looked sternly at everyone. One of the parents awkwardly said that he was the strongest person. Another awkwardly laughed and asked if they should return to their seats after all. He agreed with him, stuttering a little. Siegfried exhaled, after which Sage Media Poison, who is also a heroine of the 7 Stars, came up to him. She said that they had not seen each other for a long time. Had it really been half a century? He tensed up and called her by name. She sat down on a chair next to him and smiled. He said that time was passing, but she still didn't look like the headmaster of the academy. Apparently, her 70th birthday hadn't changed her much. She asked if every girl wanted to stay beautiful until she died. If he just asked, her blessing could make him look 10 years younger. He frowned and said that she was turning 70 the day after tomorrow, and she still hadn't matured. People should value their inner world, not their outer shell. She began to laugh and flirt, saying that he was an old mold. Why was he still the same as he was 50 years ago? He called her an old hag. She smiled and said that the unbending old man had changed a lot. He had even invited him to such places once. They looked at all the people, and one of them said that he hated breathing the same air with these selfish bastards. Siegfried thought about it, and Media asked, hugging her knee, did she think his granddaughter was pretty? He remained silent, and she said that it seemed like it was about to start. The students were arrogantly discussing everyone they saw. Kama was standing somewhere alone, looking around sadly. He became upset and asked if he was the only one with black hair. Another student asked teasingly if this was the black-haired foreigner he had heard about. The protagonist thought that he was also a special student among the noble assholes. And he was supposed to be modest? Suddenly, in the distance, he noticed one student, whom everyone was looking at and admiring. He looked at this student, and thought that this was the granddaughter of the Sword Emperor Abel von Nibelung, the main character of the game, and she is the very reason why he squandered a fortune. Subspace, the hero ancestor, Valor, created this space, at the same time as the Academy. It is a reality separate from them. Pain is felt in full, but in the subspace, one cannot actually die. The reality of the subspace has no relation to the real existence. There is no interference from the real world, even murder is not noticed there. Siegfried asked, a battle royale in the subspace? Media folded her hands on her knees and said, agreeing with him, subspace battles are a tradition in their school, but this year they will try something different in the format of a battle royale. They will divide the participants into groups of 10 people. They will be ranked in order of survival. Siegfried said with a stern expression, so it turns out that this is a survival game. Media raised her index finger and said with a smile, there are no restrictions on the battle yet. He looked at her and asked, if there are no restrictions, then does that mean that the privileged kids have a free hand? She looked at him and told him not to even talk about it. She had to make the biggest compromise possible. Like it or not, the academy is mainly funded by the nobility. She had to go through so much to implement this system. He was surprised and said that so that's how it is. At this time, someone in the crowd of students said that she was a special student. The protagonist looked at her shyly. There were many guys around her who admired her. He thought that she was terribly beautiful. If he were to be honest, he thought that she was just a 2D character. But now he felt so sorry for those poor fools trying to get close to her. Although, maybe if he didn't know, maybe he would have acted the same way. He was lucky that he still played. Abel is a player with the miraculous blessing of him. If he said it another way, she is related to the protagonist of this game. And no wonder the beautiful ones always have someone by their side. He looked after the guys who followed Abel. He thought that besides, someone like him, especially a student, was not at all up to their level. He turned around and thought that he would like to not get involved in all this and not end up in a noisy school life. He looked at the book in his hands and listed 3 principles that he had outlined for his future. He needed to graduate without incident, get a normal job, and lead a safe life. The book said that the most preferred position was hero, with an extremely high salary. He thought, did they write hero? That was the same trembling that almost brings you to death. Just from touching a knife his body begins to shake. He still shuddered at the thought of it. He slammed the book shut and thought that they should protect the world themselves, and he would look for some other comfortable job. The loudspeaker hanging in the air announced that the class exam for the 783rd year of the Joaquin Academy was about to begin. Now they would explain the rules. The protagonist looked at the loudspeaker and thought that it was starting. The loudspeaker announced that this year, as announced earlier, there would be a battle royale. Among 10 randomly selected cadets grouped together, the person who took first place would be assigned the Star class, while the second and third places would be assigned the Dragon class. The 8th through 10th places would be assigned to normal classes. The assignments in the class would be based on these results. Points would be awarded automatically, and there was no time limit. Kama thought that this was just like in the game. His goal was the normal class. Then he would not waste time and would finish everything quickly. The loudspeaker announced that the subspace generation device was activating, and the exam was now beginning. After that, the device lit up with a bright light and the students began to be teleported. The loudspeaker said that may the blessings of heroes be with them. Kama looked at all this with confidence, and thought that he should try not to take out his knife. After a while of the exam, the students started to land on the ground, some were coughing and breathing heavily. The loudspeaker announced that the evaluation of Group 24 was over. Rachel won first place, and another student won second place. The evaluation of Group 47 was over. Saki Ryojo won first place, and Sarada won second place. Media looked at Siegfried and said that she was thinking about something. She started clicking and looking at something in the system window and said that his granddaughter had the bloodline of Chan Sung and Chalgan, so he didn't have to worry, the results would be amazing. He looked at her with an angry face and said that she could jinx everything like that. She pointed her finger at the line in the system window and told him to look at it quickly. 7 minutes and 14 seconds? That's incredibly fast. She looked at the student's card and asked if she had achieved such a result with a C-rank weapon. He said that Abel wanted to get an honest evaluation. She told him to listen to her, since she was really good. She may not have broken his record, but her efforts were in the top 10 in the history of the academy. He furrowed his brows and said that it was nothing surprising considering their Nibelung bloodline. After that, he stood up from his seat and said that it seemed like the entire event would be over soon, so it was time for him to go. She looked at him sadly and asked if there was one more group left. Didn't he want to see it? Siegfried said that it didn't matter to him anymore, since they were most likely the offspring of some pigs. He walked towards the exit and said that they would see each other next time. She sat up straighter and said with a smile that it would be in the next life. Suddenly, an unexpected feeling pierced them. Everyone around started looking around. Media grabbed the arms of the chair and shouted. Siegfried felt it too. He shouted that it was unbelievable. He thought that there was no place in the entire building where it couldn't be felt. They were completely shocked by this. After that, they looked at the portal that opened, the space in the sky broke into several pieces and 2 students fell to the ground. All the students looked at the sky in horror. One of them asked, did they really fall from under the space? The sky began to sparkle. Siegfried began to look closely and get angry. A sashimi knife fell from the sky and stuck into the ground in front of the fallen student's face. Media jumped up from her seat and shouted, pointing her finger at the medical staff to quickly check the condition of the cadets who just came out. Let them hurry. The face of the protagonist was visible in the reflection of that knife. After a while, Kama thought that the results were inevitable anyway, it was already predetermined. One of the students shouted angrily that this fool was good. The protagonist thought that, however, no matter what, even if luck was not on his side, unfortunately, it seemed that he had been assigned to the suicide squad. The protagonist watched as the evil twins beat up the students. They were from the Iron King family. Mao Jun, who held one of the participants by the hair and said that he was too weak. And Mao Shun, who held another participant's throat with a strong grip and asked, well, is it over? Let him say goodbye then. Kama thought that even if they had innate talent, their cruelty and duplicity knew no bounds. He was very angry and thought that these fools, they were just deliberately playing around, for these 30 minutes. He took a defensive stance and thought, did he really seem so weak that he was not even worth their attention? Shun looked at his opponent and asked, did he die? Then he threw him to the ground and said, walking back, that he was even bored like that. After that, he began to bend his iron fingers and count the defeated opponents. Then he looked at his brother, who was strangling another student with his foot, and asked how many of them were there in total. The student squeaked with his last strength that it was very painful for him. Let him stop. Shun was very surprised at something. Jun looked at his brother and asked, it seemed like everything was more or less over, so why are they here? Then he kicked his opponent in the throat, causing a dent and a small explosion. Shun said how everything pissed him off. He said that he caught 4. Jun pointed his finger forward and said that he left this one to him. His brother looked at the girl in front of them and said that he agreed with this. The girl's body was shaking violently, there was fear on her face. The protagonist clenched his teeth and watched what was happening. He thought it was the one who was sitting quietly in the corner. He got even angrier and thought that she seemed to be in a stupor and didn't seem to have the desire to fight. Shun walked towards the girl and said mockingly that his brother should just watch this. He clenched his iron fist and said with a crazy smile that he thought she was his type. But he was more interested in whether he would like that scream that would escape from those cute lips. He wanted to know so badly. June smirked and said that even though he was his younger brother, he was such a pervert. Shun licked his lips and asked, so where should he start tearing her apart? Kama caught their attention with his scream. The brothers looked at him in surprise. He shouted, even if they were in subspace, why would they go that far? Are they psychopaths? He thought he had found an adventure for his ass. Shun asked, what is this? Another rival? June said, turning to his brother, that there is a badge with that guy's name on it. Shun looked at his badge and asked, is he a special student? How pathetic. Then the brothers looked at each other and laughed at Kama. Shun went to him and said that he will quickly deal with him now. His brother agreed with him. He clenched his fist, and June said that he should rip out his tongue so that he would not dare to insult them anymore. Shun said that he understood him. The protagonist thought, so what should he do now? Should he activate the blessing of painlessness? No, they have been torturing corpses for half an hour already. So painlessness for 30 seconds will not help him. Suddenly it dawned on him, and his bag glowed from the sashimi knife. He thought that if he took the knife in his hands, the blessing would definitely activate. He remembered the terrible pain that pierced him from activating the blessing. He remembered his sword god's blessing in all its glory. He thought that he should be normal, he would pass everything without incident in complete safety. But not even half a day had passed since he accepted these principles. The brothers looked at him in surprise, and Shun asked, what is this? Kama took out a knife from his bag, which was glowing with magical power. They looked at him silently at first, and then they began to laugh madly and asked, what kind of joke is this? He is a stupid fool. Chloe Auditor de Cecilia looked at what was happening, confused. Shun then prepared to attack and shouted that since he dared to open his mouth at them, he would hurt him as much as possible. He pushed off the ground and shouted that he would first smash his stupid head. The protagonist looked at him and thought that he was in no position to nitpick now. He only had 30 seconds. He thought he could try to resolve everything. He should be able to do it. He used the blessing of painlessness and got into a fighting stance. A system window popped up saying that for 30 seconds, all pain would be suppressed by the blessing of painlessness. The skill's duration is 30 seconds. The cooldown will last 12 hours. He thought it was a blessing. Another system window popped up saying that the blessing of the sword god was activated. He thought that the skill would neutralize the pain caused by the blessing of the sword god. Shun swung his iron hand and shouted, what the hell is he capable of with this pathetic toothpick? Stupid fool. Kama thought that if he couldn't attack, he would die along with this knife. He clenched his teeth and thought, throwing his head back, how hard everything was. He didn't have to cut up a fish, but a person. Why do gangsters in movies carry sashimi knives? He remembered asking his master if it was really possible to hurt a person. Not just cut fish? He called him a fool and said that it was only in the movies. Even the second coming would not change that idiot. He remembered the information that they would be inflicted with additional cuts if he attacked the enemy. He looked closely at his opponent's iron hand, and then delivered his blow. He remembered what the loudspeaker announced, may the blessing of the gods be with them. He cut off his hand and shouted for him to die, because he was bad. He looked at his severed hand in shock and fell. The newly cut iron hand fell in front of him. The protagonist remembered his conversation with the boss. Then he asked him why gangsters use a sashimi knife. Before he could finish speaking, a knife was stuck into the wall near his head. He was very scared and said something unintelligible in confusion. The boss looked at him with a serious face and asked, he said to address him as, Master, and why is he so interested in this? He thought that his first teacher used to be a thug. And in order to get out, he had to cut off his wrists. Later, he opened a sashimi restaurant because he wanted to please people with his knife skills. Kama asked him then why gangsters use sashimi knives in movies? He wondered, is it the same in real life? His master wiped his chin and said that someone who owns a knife should not ask such questions. Let him think for himself that if you cut off a body part with an ordinary kitchen knife, everything will turn into a mess. And a sashimi knife is narrow, you can work with jeweler's precision. The main character asked with interest, why not slice? Wouldn't it work with people the same way as with fish? He started yelling at him for asking stupid questions, It was all because the fish was lying on the table. If it had been upright, he wouldn't have cut off even a piece. He started swearing. He said with a guilty look that in manga, no matter how much he'd seen, there was always a clean cut. Maybe his boss just lacked skill. He hit him with all his might and yelled, "What an annoying employee. Even the god of knives couldn't do that." Did he understand him? Shun was currently frozen in midair and looking at his severed iron arm. The others were also looking at it. Shun grabbed the remaining part of his arm and started yelling curses. He yelled that his arm hurt so much. Let him stay away from him. He yelled and grunted in pain. He fell to the ground, and tears gathered at the corners of his eyes. He yelled that he already told him not to come near at all. Let someone help him. He turned around and ran away from his opponent, then screamed to be saved. June looked at his brother in confusion. Shun was reaching out to him and screaming for help. This kid was just crazy. He was crying from fear and panic. Suddenly, he felt his face being cut by the main character. He screamed that he was dying. He didn't have time to finish speaking, as Kama cut off half of his head with one blow with his knife along the chosen trajectory. June looked at this in horror, his face covered in sweat. The top of Shun's head fell in front of his feet. He screamed his brother's name in panic. Chloe watched what was happening in horror. June got angry and thought that he shouldn't panic yet. This was empty subspace. He did it with such a knife? Shun didn't really die. But what happened to this idiot? Something tells him that this is the first time he stabbed a person. He took a fighting stance and thought, why is he so scared? His opponent was just lucky. But he is sure of it. He needs to be wary of this knife. Shun's mistake was probably his carelessness. He took his iron hand and thought, if that's the case, then he will use double the power. He put on the second iron hand and shouted that this weapon works better if you put it on both hands. His resolution protection blessing has been strengthened. The jumping power of the intervention blessing has been increased by 200%. The striking power of the spirit blessing has also increased. He smiled madly and confidently shouted to activate all three blessings. This is an A-rank blessing. A pauper can only dream of this. He has no idea where he found this knife. But even with a C-rank weapon, he can handle him. He is not Shun. Kama was trembling all over and counting the seconds so as not to miss the moment. June swung his iron hand and screamed, why did he stand rooted to the spot? Did he piss himself? He still has time to babble under his breath. He will smash his head in 1-2 right now. The protagonist was still counting the seconds. He thought, what is this at all? After some time, June was lying lifeless on the ground, his body pierced by several knives. Kama held the knife with trembling hands and counted the last seconds. June's eyes were closing, he was lying covered in blood and silent. And his opponent counted to 0. A system window popped up saying that the effect of the blessing of painlessness had ended. After that, the protagonist suddenly screamed in pain and thought about the ghost. After some time, he opened his eyes and tried to understand where he was. Then he asked, is this a hospital? He sat up in bed and, pushing away the blanket, writhed in pain. The man entered his room, and he looked at him in surprise. He turned around and shouted, adjusting his glasses, that the student had already woken up. Kama looked at the people who entered and thought that he had never seen this face, but he had to recognize it. The one who defeated the commander of the 6th Legion, the Demon Lord, 50 years ago. He is the second of the 7-star heroes, also the strongest of humans, Isekai'd. Media smiled at him warmly and asked, waving her hand, is he feeling well? The protagonist thought that this was the director of the academy, and the sage Media. But why did these people come to him? He looked at them in confusion and tried to say something. Isekai'd asked what his name was. He told him his name. He looked at him carefully, and said that they should get straight to the point. What did he do there? Kama remained silent and thought that it felt like it was not a fantasy, it really was him. Then he looked at the sword handle in Isekai'd's hand and thought that it was no good that he noticed him. He said that even though they were in a subspace, he felt that the two of them had gone too far. However, he thought that he had used too much force, so he was willing to accept any punishment. They made eye contact, and Media crossed her arms and said with a sigh that he was such an old fool. How could he behave like that with that young man? She sat down on the main character's bed and, hugging him with her arms, said that he should not listen to this old man. She would tell him a secret that it was Isekai'd who had cleared his clogged blood vessels. Hadn't he heard that people only became more stubborn with age? She smiled sheepishly and said that he was actually very cute. Siegfried indignantly shouted that he had asked her not to say such things. She laid her head on Calm's shoulder and said, "What an embarrassed old fool." She looked at the student's shoulders and told him to just look at those shoulders. He was very surprised and thought, but why did he do that? Now he understood why his body was so light, like a feather, or rather, a wet feather. Then she told him with admiration that while he was unconscious, they watched a video recording of what happened in subspace. She screamed at the way he bravely rushed to save the poor student. She raised her hands up and screamed that he was just the real prince she dreamed of. She wiped the drool from her mouth and said that he was that very prince. Siegfried coughed and tried to stop her. She turned to him and started screaming angrily at him to stop already. He asked her to try to act at least a little more mature. She smiled and said that she couldn't promise that she wouldn't learn from his actions during the exam, but he didn't have to worry. The Mao twins hadn't gotten into this academy in a completely honest way. They said that they would write their own expulsion letter. She continued to look at him with hungry eyes. The protagonist turned away and thought, so that's how it was. He felt relieved. Apparently, he wouldn't have to deal with them at school. Siegfried said that they had come to tell him about it. He asked in surprise, "Really?" After that, he thanked them. She said that he had the best result. The protagonist looked at them in surprise, and they told him to accept their congratulations. He smiled awkwardly and asked, what were they talking about? At that moment, he thought that he wanted to stay safe and sound. Why is everything like this? Sometime later, at the Joaquin Academy. The principal's office was visible through the window of the academy building. Media was sitting with her legs crossed and holding a mug in her hand. She looked to the side and said that she had been leading this academy for almost 20 years and that this was the first time something like this had happened in her memory. Some time ago, when they came to visit a student in the ward, Kama said with a dissatisfied face that he didn't like all this. Media and Siegfried looked at him in surprise. She asked him if he didn't understand what it meant to be in the star class. Did she hear something wrong? All the elders were furious, but the decision to award the title of Best Cadet was based on the evaluation results of the subspace itself. The protagonist thought about it, and then he looked at them and said that he still didn't like it. Siegfried silently looked at him with a serious look, and Media was very angry. She told him that he didn't understand anything at all. In the present, she called out Siegfried's name and asked if he was upset because Kama overtook his granddaughter. But he saw it all himself. He raised his mug of tea and said that it was not like that at all. He looked at her sternly and said that there was nothing more foolish than questioning the judgment of the subspace created by the founding hero himself. The academy had chosen him, and they had followed that decision. He thought that it was simply a matter of if he had more outstanding or physically very developed abilities, he would have resigned himself. If he had many times more experience, he would not have objected. But what this boy who had barely reached adulthood showed. After all, his movements seemed to embody a certain concept. He had devoted his entire life to the art of the sword and had reached the level of a master. And yet, the uneasy feeling he had felt when he had unblocked the boy's meridians. He had a body that had never been subjected to heavy physical labor. But he felt as if there was something inside him that should not be there. He silently took a sip of tea, and then he put the cup back on the saucer. He thought that at his age, the spirit of competition was still there, especially towards a guy the same age as his granddaughter. Media said he had cute features, and the way he fought off enemies to protect a girl was simply adorable. If only she were 10 years younger, although maybe she still had a chance? She crossed her arms and asked, grinning, what the old man thought about that. Siegfried took the cup in his hands and asked if she knew what the cadets called people like her in their days. She looked at him in surprise. Then she leaned her elbows on the arm of the sofa and said that he should open his big mouth. Let him tell him what they called people like her. He abruptly put the cup down on the saucer, and she looked at him expectantly. He confidently uttered the same curse. Her eyes turned red with rage, and then she screamed in anger so loudly that the tea in her cup shook. After some time, Kama stood near the entrance to the wolf class. He looked at the sign and thought that this was the best compromise he could come to. He remembered Media yelling at him that he was going to the top class. He told her then that he wanted to go to the tiger class. She screamed that the best cadet could not study there. He asked, but why? The school was fighting for equality. She screamed that the tiger class was full to the brim. Her face was covered in sweat, and she put her finger to her mouth and said that then they would do this. She would not tell anyone anything, and he would not go to the tiger class. She put her fingers to her chin and thought that if he went to the tiger class, the elders would make such a noise. The protagonist looked at her silently, and thought that his plan was to quietly study in some low-level class, and not to fight for power with the elite. In real time, he sighed and opened the door of the classroom. He thought that, of course, it was not ideal, but also relatively good. When he entered the classroom, the doors slammed behind him so loudly that all the students turned their attention to him. He looked around the classroom with horror, where the students were. Some students did not pay attention to him, because he was a special student. He began to go down the stairs and thought that so that they would not even look at him, they should just ignore him. Then he sat down in his seat and thought that as he wanted complete ignorance. It seems that the director managed to keep everything a secret. Loners have a special lifestyle. In fact, it may be for the best. Then he turned around, and there stood an embarrassed Chloe. She walked up to him and awkwardly apologized to him, and then she thanked him for what he did that time. He looked at her questioningly. She sheepishly clarified that it was during the exam. Kama said that she was talking about that incident. He thought, why is she treating him like an elder if they are the same age? He smiled and said that she shouldn't thank him for that. He thought that anyone in his place would have done the same. He thought that everyone might think that he saved her, but that was not true. Chloe hung her head and said that was not true at all. He thought that in reality, he wanted to save his own skin. Now he felt like a hypocrite. He smiled and said that if they thought that way, then they had never met. After that, he introduced himself. She smiled and introduced herself to him too. The main character said that he was pleased to meet her. He didn't know that they would end up in the same class. She said that she was very pleased too. He thought that he didn't remember her at all. Who was she? He had played most of the game, but he didn't know her. As far as he knew, the main story in the late game was focused on fighting demons. A new character had appeared too suddenly. She was probably a minor character like him. Then he extended his hand to her, and asked with a smile if she could keep what happened at the exam a secret. She was confused at first, but then agreed with him. She shyly said that at least if he didn't mind. She didn't have time to finish speaking, because their instructor, Lee Won-bin, entered the room. He shouted that everyone needed to quickly take their seats. They were a little scared, and Kama said that they would talk later. She agreed with him and went to her seat. The instructor threw the textbook behind his podium and shouted that, first of all, he congratulated all the students on their admission. They were the chosen ones destined to inherit the will of the founding hero of valor. They should be proud of it. After that, he introduced himself and said that he was the head instructor of the Tiger class. Since today was their first day, they would start with something simple with training. He asked everyone to change clothes and said that he would be waiting for them at the training ground in 30 minutes. One of the students raised his hand and asked, apologizing, what kind of training course was this? Won-bin put his hands on the counter and said that it was simple 100 push-ups, 100 squats and 100 sit-ups. And then they had to run 10 laps. He shouted that if everyone understood everything, then they should quickly go change clothes and come to the ground. The students agreed with him in unison. The protagonist looked at the leaving students and thought, is this training really necessary to turn students into dumb soldiers? After that, he approached the instructor and addressed him. Won-bin asked what happened to him. The instructor thought, how did he know him? Although this is not so important now, what is more important is what he wanted to tell him. He said that he does not feel very well. He thought that he should try to somehow get out of this lesson. The instructor thought about it, and shouted that he thought that this training would not make the best cadet feel better. Maybe he should go to the star class on the first day. The headmistress allowed him to attend all the classes of the top class. Kama thought that here was an old hag who allowed himself to be manipulated. He smiled awkwardly and said, scratching the back of his head, that he did not think so. If he went to the toilet, everything would resolve itself. And the training would only make him feel better. His insight impressed him. The instructor shouted that, as befits a best cadet, he was very honest. They would see each other at the training very soon. The protagonist agreed with him and left. Some time later, he was running around the playground and breathing heavily. The instructor shouted at the students to move. He also encouraged their fighting spirit, and shouted that they needed to run forward and faster. Kama was running with all his strength and cursing, trying to keep up with the others. The instructor repeated that they needed to keep up the pace and not fall behind. He was already dying from the lack of habit. Chloe ran up to him and asked if it was hard for him to run. He looked very pale and tired. His body was covered in sweat. He looked at her in surprise and continued running. Then he smiled awkwardly and said that he was fine. She asked what lap he was running. He hesitantly said that it was probably his 5th lap. And what was hers? She was probably lagging behind quite well too. She said that she was already on her 9th. He was very surprised by this, and she smiled and screamed at him to try harder. She clenched her fists and screamed that he could do anything. After that, she overtook him and ran forward. The protagonist continued to run and breathed heavily. After a while, Kama was in his dorm. There were a bunch of empty water bottles in his room. He put one of the bottles on the nightstand and cursed, lying on his bed. He was really hungry. He thought that he had only been in this academy for 1 week, and he had already encountered an unexpected problem. While all the other students could afford to eat in the local cafeteria, he stood there and screamed that he was so damn hungry. He then ran to the buffet and screamed that he would have 1 pork belly and quickly. After that, the buffet employee looked at him impudently and hinted that he should put his food stamp in. Kama looked at the counter and thought, there is a trash can for food stamps. He thought he also has to pay for the food there? He smiled then and shouted that he would get his ticket right away. He just ordered an advance rice with pork belly. Suddenly he saw the prices of various dishes and was shocked. His dish cost 50,000 won. He stopped dead in his tracks and repeated the amount he had just seen. He could not understand at all why they charged so much for a school lunch. That was why he lived on every drop of water that he bought himself. In the present tense, he finished another bottle of water and threw it away in anger that he could not eat properly. He was very angry and thought that they were charging 50,000 won for a bowl of rice with pork. This was too much. He shouted that he was really hungry. He thought, what kind of price list are they? He was almost out of money. He remembered how his father gave him money and told him to take it with him for pocket money. After that, he looked sadly at the empty bottle lying next to him. The protagonist was so angry at the whole world that he buried himself in his blanket. He thought that he was a big idiot. He should have taken the money and not turned his nose up. He had been surviving on the cheapest water for several days now. A system window popped up in front of him, saying that his physical condition had increased to 12 units. As his physical condition improved, the requirements for the sword would decrease. He was very surprised and thought that as soon as he thought about it, the blessing window would immediately appear. He was silent for a while, and then he smiled and went to the mirror. He lifted his t-shirt and said with a satisfied face that he had not wasted his time after all. His body had become a little bigger and more athletic. He looked at his hands and asked if the blessing of the sword god had purified his blood vessels. If he thought about it, it was somewhat reminiscent of evolution. He thought that the blessing of the sword god had not improved yet, but if he continued to practice, he might be able to use a small but still sword. At this moment, he silently looked at his sashimi knives. He thought that he was afraid to hold a knife during the entrance ceremony, and now his hands were itching to hold this. Was this the influence of the blessing on him? Why did he feel so proud? He scratched his head while looking in the mirror, but suddenly someone knocked on his door. He turned around and asked who it could be. He opened the door and saw an embarrassed Chloe there. She apologized to him and tried to find other words. She asked if she could disturb him for a while. He wondered why she was there. He awkwardly invited her into the room and asked her what was wrong. She looked at him guiltily and said that she had not seen him in the dining hall all week, so she was worried about him. Suddenly, he felt unwell. He made up an excuse and said that he just didn't like the food they cooked there. And in his head he was foaming at the mouth and screaming that he loved absolutely all the food. She pressed herself to her body parts and said that she understood everything. He told her not to worry about him. Chloe said that if he didn't mind, she would like to buy groceries and cook something together. At that moment, he had already come out of his room, throwing on a tracksuit, and told her with a smile that they should go quickly. She was very surprised by this and asked why so soon. He happily asked, didn't she just offer to cook dinner for him? She was confused and agreed with him. He walked towards the store, happily humming a song, and said that he cooked very well, so they could do it in no time. She started running after him and calling his name. He asked, but her dorm is across the street, isn't it? She shouted after him to wait for her. After a while they were already in her room. She said admiringly, covering her mouth, that it was very tasty. He looked at her and said that he was glad that she liked it. She said that she had tried such amazing food, and he had cooked everything so quickly. It was simply amazing. He just looked and said nothing. She said that she usually only boiled fish, but she didn't even know that she would ever try something like this. Some time ago, when they first arrived, Kama asked if he could look in her refrigerator. She agreed with him and they sat down, looking inside. He looked at the large number of containers with fish and said that she really liked fish. She told him that she lived near the sea. He admired this and said that it was good, because he was very good at fish dishes. She asked him if he was lying. He thought that he was very lucky, he just wanted to cook something. At least he would warm up a little by making some sashimi. But he had a problem in the form of the blessing of the sword god. He looked at the kitchen knives in horror, then he turned to her and asked if she had any longer knives. She asked him again so that she could pick out the right tools for him. He agreed and said that she had seen his weapon. It was a little awkward for him to cut with it. Then she agreed with him and went to look for it. After a while, she called him by name and showed her dagger with a smile. She asked him if this would suit him. He was surprised and looked at her silently. He pretended that if he was going to cook, then he would use a kitchen knife. In his head, he began to get scared and thought that she had brought a katana to school. He got ready for work and thought that he couldn't do anything about it. He had to finish in 30 seconds. He took the kitchen knife in his hand and pointed it at the fish. After that, a system window popped up that the blessing of painlessness was activated. She watched him work with admiration. He thought that he was famous as the best knife maker in the country, so he should be able to do it. At that moment, the blessing of the sword god was activated. He began to cut up fish after fish. The protagonist thought that it took him 21 seconds to clean the fish from scales, remove the bones, take out the entrails and cut. After that, he stood and admired his work. Chloe giggled next to him, anticipating a delicious dinner. He thought that he did it so well, and he still survived. She came up and asked how he managed to do everything so wonderfully. He told her that he used to work part-time at a Japanese restaurant. She was very surprised and asked again, how did he work part-time? At first he was silent, and then he asked, she probably doesn't even know what processing is, does she? She agreed with him and apologized. He calmed her down and asked her not to apologize for it. Kama thought that this was the difference between them. He told her with a smile that he was glad she liked it. She nodded her head happily, agreeing with him. She began to glow with joy and said that since he cooked the dish, then she would wash it all. He thanked her and said that he was counting on her. After a while, Chloe diligently washed the dishes, and he stood aside and smiled. He looked at the moon and thought that he finally ate. He even wanted to sing. And such a beautiful moon was shining in the sky. The clatter of dishes sounded behind him. She screamed that she was very sorry that she could scare him with these. He was scared and silent. There was the clatter of dishes again. She screamed her apologies and tried to figure out what she was doing wrong. He laughed awkwardly and suddenly wondered if she ever washed dishes. Although he himself had started learning to do so at about her age. There was her desk next to him, and one of her books had fallen off. He noticed it, and the book fell to the floor and opened. He was surprised and looked at it more closely. He thought it was her diary. It said that she had met a guy at the class placement exam today. He had helped her a lot, so she should return the favor. He looked at the diary with a smile and thought that she had pretty cute handwriting and cute stickers. He should probably put it back. Chloe was no different from girls her age. After that, a wind blew in the room and turned over several pages in the diary. Kama was very surprised by this and said that the pages turned by themselves. It said that the guy who saved her was in the same class with her. She had learned his name, and now her heart was pounding so hard she didn't know what to do. She couldn't bring herself to talk to him at all. He sighed and thought that was nice enough. That was why she had trouble talking to him. Maybe he could read something else. He turned a few pages and saw a whole spread with the words she loved him written on it. He was a little scared and thought that this was the same phrase she had written more than 100 times. Behind him he heard the clatter of dishes becoming more distinct. He abruptly closed her diary, and she stood there glaring at him. She asked dryly, had he seen all this? Killing monsters is a noble occupation that brings honor and respect to the hero families, strengthening their authority in society. However, behind this authority are hidden the personal interests of the elite, who exploit the weaker sections of the population. When corrupt officials turn a blind eye to these problems, one of the hero families, Auditor de Cecilia, comes into the picture. They operate in the shadows, but their goal is the light, and they kill the infidels, maintaining order. Children in the Auditor family undergo harsh psychological training even before they reach adolescence, in order to suppress their emotions and become mercenaries. At the age of 15, young Chloe stained her hands with blood for the first time. An old man standing next to her said, "Chloe Auditor de Cecilia, she must not deny her essence as a mercenary." This was the first thing she heard before reaching adulthood. Chloe obeyed. Constant training distorted the girl's psyche, leaving a deep wound in her heart. When her personality was almost erased, and only echoes of emotions remained, she reached the age where she could enter the academy. At the Hoenn Academy, classes are assigned depending on individual skills. Each member of the auditor family who aspires to become a shadow has dragon class abilities, but due to family traditions and the treaty between the family and the academy, they are considered ordinary. The old man told her not to draw attention to herself. Even here, the family took away those 3 years of youthful couple, depriving her of all freedom. Chloe accepted her fate without a word of opposition. She submitted, believing that nothing would change until she met one guy. Turning to the Mao brothers, shouted, "Hey! Have you completely lost your minds, fools? They should not touch her." During the battle royale in subspace, despite the fact that it is impossible to die there, Chloe encountered death for the first time. She was not afraid, but Shun shouted, "So there is still one left?" She was calmly prepared to accept the inevitable. She had been taught to live differently, and this was how she would spend the rest of her days. Shun had shouted as he approached the main character that he would finish him off and then return to her. That was right, nothing would have changed. Fate had been so obvious, or so it had seemed before. At that moment, it was as if the sun had broken through the dark clouds. Something hot had been born inside her, a sword that had no power over you. A sword that could protect someone. She had become the reason why that guy had used his knife. And she remembered a fairy tale that she had loved to read as a child and which she had hidden behind her bed. The tale told of a princess locked in a tower and the love of a prince. In the story, everything revolved around the prince and saving people. Her cheeks flushed, her heart fluttered in her chest. A previously unknown feeling had been born inside her. There was only one guess: it was love, damn it. Kama smiled awkwardly, looking at Chloe, who was wearing cleaning gloves. He scratched his head awkwardly and continued to stare at her silently. Damn, he had ruined everything. Where did it all go wrong? When he first saw this young girl? Or when he stupidly agreed to have dinner with her? Scratching his head awkwardly again, he said, "Chloe, she should just look at how beautiful the moon is." She didn't answer, and he put his hand out in front of him and thanked her. It had been a long time since he had eaten such a delicious meal. Then he smiled and waved at her, saying that he would probably go. They would meet again. Taking off her gloves, she asked, "Did he see everything?" He asked in surprise, "Huh? What?" She pointed to the diary and said this. He looked at the notebook and asked, "Is she talking about her book? She must be studying really hard." But she interrupted him and said that it was her diary. The protagonist wondered, did she have eyes in the back of her head? How did she see that? And it was so awkward because of her manner of speech, oh my god. In an instant, she became a completely different person. He exclaimed that he hadn't seen anything. She asked, "Nothing?" He answered, "Huh? Yes, nothing." She told him not to lie, and he said, "Okay," he admits. There was silence between them, and the next moment, Chloe took her sword out of its sheath. Kama's mouth opened in surprise, beads of sweat rolled down his face, and he thought, just like that. Looking out the window, he realized that the window was not the exit. 4th floor, right under the roof. If he jumped from here, he would break all his legs. Looking at the door behind Chloe, he realized that this was the only exit. That's it, he's trapped. Turning around, he thought, what is she doing? The tip of the sword slid across the floor, and she slowly approached him. He thought, is she really going to attack? Come on, is she unconscious? He could roughly recognize such a state, the fixed pupils, the dull red eyes that looked lifeless. He was sure that she was a Yandere. Moreover, a very energetic mood that could change in an instant. Could it be a split personality? Yandere already had a rather complex character, and now this? He thought that his actions could have served as an impetus for such a change in her personality. How scary, she would probably haunt him until he died. He had to think of something to somehow protect himself. Her lust for killing was much stronger than that of the Mao twins. Life in the academy really is cruel. First, he needed to somehow get out of this situation. He had to think. There were 9 seconds left. The sashimi knife was in his room. Looking at the knife on the cutting board, he thought, maybe he should take that knife? No, if he tried to get to the knife, there was a 100% chance he would lose an arm or a leg. She began to swing her sword, and the protagonist glanced to the side, focused his attention on the stationary knife, as the next moment Chloe was already decisively approaching him. Striking the stationary sword in front of him, he thought that he wanted to solve the problem with words. Damn it! A system window appeared, which said that the user's mental state was increasing along with his ingenuity. Words and actions were temporarily filled with an eliminating aura. The restraining force was adjusted to the user. The divine protection of the sword god was activated. May the blessing of the gods be with him. Addressing Chloe, the protagonist said that her hair was a bit long. He offered to trim the ends a bit, and the next moment, the ends of her hair fell on the floor. The next morning, Chloe woke up with a headache and, holding her head, asked, "Kama? Where did he go?" She looked around and repeated his name. She remembered how he looked out the window while she was washing the dishes, and how she stole a glance at him. Then she looked to the side and exclaimed in fear, "Her katana!" She saw her weapon, which was standing by the side of the work table. Chloe sighed and thought, a weight off her soul. She often fell out of reality before, when she held this in her hands. The old man praised her, and she thought, what happened here? The old man said that she should not worry, and she should not deny her essence of a mercenary. Then she buried her head in the pillow and, breathing heavily, exclaimed, "Chloe! She was such an idiot! Why did she have to lose control of herself then?" Kama! Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and she wondered if she had said something weird at that moment. Looking away, she saw a box cutter on the floor and asked, "Huh? Why was a box cutter lying on the floor?" A strand of hair brushed her cheek. She asked, "Huh? Was it her imagination or did her hair get shorter? Maybe that knife had been used to cut it?" She saw her hair in the trash and wondered if he had just cleaned up and left. Kama really was that caring. Her cheeks flushed again, and her gaze was filled with love. She thought she should write about it in her diary before she forgot. Then she sat down at the table and opened her notebook. Smiling sheepishly, she said, like this, and wrote that she loved Kama. A while ago, the protagonist leaned against a tree and threw up. He thought he had somehow managed to cope with this situation. The system window reported that the blessing of painlessness had ended. He wiped his mouth and thought that he had exceeded the time limit by 5 seconds, and this was the result. Then he felt the urge again and thought, God, the whole dinner is going to come out at this rate. Sitting down on the bench and leaning against the back, he sighed heavily and thought that they had eaten everything clean. And I am hungry, Chloe. He looked at the full moon in the sky and thought, who the hell is she? Typically, the goal of a sword fight is to either end the enemy's life in one blow, or to subdue him. However, Chloe's katana mercilessly hits vital organs. It feels like her sword is a weapon only for killing. If he got ambushed, he most likely lost his head. Feeling a threat to his life, he instinctively aimed for the back of her head. Luckily, the knife was short, he only managed to cut her hair. Sighing again, he put his hand to his chest and thought, I quickly cleaned up, so there shouldn't be any problems. Everything seemed fine, stable, reliable, and safe. It turns out it's not that simple. They say that being ordinary is the hardest thing. He thinks that's true. In fact, when he first got involved in this new game, he had much more ambition. For someone like him, who reached the pinnacle of skill with only a sashimi knife, giving up simple human romance was not an easy step. However, everyone has their own role. The Blessing of Miracles is the name of both the game and the unique blessing of the protagonist, who he has yet to meet. As far as he remembers, there are only 2 legendary blessings in the game other than the Blessing of Valor Wakin. He intuitively understands that the essence of the blessing is simple: they must save the world from the Demon King. The protagonist was chosen as a patron saint, and even the demonic sword Bamung recognized his power. On the contrary, he only knows how to use sashimi knives. Is there anything else to explain? He slapped his cheeks and shouted, Focus! Ever since entering the academy, the constant encounters with incomprehensible numbers and situations make him forget about his desires. Looking at the falling stars, he said, what should he do? There are no ordinary people in this game, right? He has a vague idea of the main characters, but his understanding of the game world is still very limited. It has been a little over a week since he entered the academy. According to the story, now is the time for the protagonist's blessing to manifest, and he is just finishing the admission process. This means that the game's plot is about to unfold. He knows the general plot, but the ending remains unknown. He can't believe that he regrets quitting the game. His advantage is that he knows the official plot until about halfway through. No matter what happens, he must follow it. He imagined how a character in a game with the first level was at a crossroads. If he goes to the right, maybe he will become a king. If he goes to the left, he will get a quiet life, the official path. If he mixes up the cards, he can do something that he will not be able to clean up later. If his memory serves him right, the situation has only gotten worse since the second month of the third year. Sensing the birth of a hero, the demons, led by the king, join forces and go to war against the academy. Over time, the gap between demons and humans will widen, a world war will break out, and just like that, the plot of the game will flow into the fantasy mobile game template. Looking at the phone screen, he asked, "What's going on? Why is the story taking such a turn?" He was already looking for the charm of youth as an adult because he had never experienced anything like this. While working as a cook, he looked at his phone screen again and asked, "How could they all die like this?" The prospect of this is simply terrifying. He thought that he was so attached to these characters, that's why he deleted the game. But he is very scared that a terrible war is happening in this world. He sighed, looked at the starry sky again and thought, war, will he also die on the battlefield? No. There are just under 3 years left. Now he needs to come down to earth, and not fantasize about a quiet life. He can't just die like this. You need to become stronger and survive. Most of the game's storylines of such mobile games usually have a happy ending. Most likely, the main character will save this world. But he needs strength to protect himself. You can't live and shake from every rustle. Therefore, you need to learn to survive without attracting too much attention to yourself. If he stands out, he may be called to fight a crowd of demons, and this cannot be allowed. In addition, you need to be careful with the use of the blessing of the sword god. He was forced to pick up a sashimi knife, but the load on his body was too great. A system window appeared in front of him, which said, "The blessing of the sword god, when attacking, the enemy will be inflicted with additional cuts." He read the information and said, "The performance is certainly impressive, but..." Then he thoughtfully put his fingers to his chin and thought about the fact that a lot of new information appeared. Physical and spiritual strength, weapons, the numbers seem to represent levels or ranks. And this is the mastery coefficient. What is it? He put his finger on the system window and said this. However, a message appeared on the system window saying that access was restricted due to unmet conditions. He asked what, but then thought that it was not that important now. Thinking about it, he sat down on the bench and told himself that another point had been added to this mysterious ability. The most important thing was physical training. And he also needed a new weapon. You can't rely on the blessing of painlessness forever. The effect was this: the blessing of painlessness for 30 seconds, all pain is blocked. Activation time 30 seconds, recharge 12 hours. He thought that he also needed to train with a weapon that did not meet the conditions of the blessing of the sword god. Fortunately, next month, the midterm exams would be replaced by practical classes in martial arts. He glanced at the calendar and thought, the training reward is Murasame. Rank Class B. If he can handle it, it will be enough to receive a diploma. Its stats don't meet the conditions for activating the sword god's blessing, so it can be used as a main weapon. He said that it would take more effort than he thought. Then Abel called out to him. She walked up to him, holding up her sweat-soaked shirt, and said that this was her seat. He looked at her in surprise, their eyes met, and she asked if he wanted to move over. He said, "Huh?" He thought, Abel, damn, this doesn't seem real even though she's standing right in front of him. He stared at her, how stupid. She said that she wasn't kicking him out, she was just asking him to move a little to the side. He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye and thought, her seat? Aren't the benches shared? Or has the class divide gotten in here? If he gets carried away by her, the main story will definitely get complicated. He should somehow avoid that. She kept pulling her shirt down, and he watched, and thought she was so pretty it was almost drool-worthy. Then she looked up at the sky and said that the stars were best seen from up there. His body shook, and he thought he was in shock. He looked at her again and thought, is this really Abel, the granddaughter of the sword saint he knows? This beautiful heroine is really hard to approach. She looked at him and asked, isn't his weapon a sword too? He asked how she knew. She looked down and said her grandfather told her. Then she looked at him and said she heard that sword masters have a slightly different view of things. The protagonist looked at her sheepishly and she picked up the hilt of her sword and said, here, will he hold this? Kama said the sword didn't seem that heavy. She looked away sheepishly and he thought, is she pouting or something? She was strange, was she really the Abel he knew? He knew her, right? He wondered if she suspected him of something. although everyone in the academy knew who Abel was. He answered more or less. Abel looked at him and said that she didn't know his name. He wondered, what was she getting at? Smiling, she asked if it wasn't too cliché. He knew her name, but she didn't know his. He asked if he should tell his name to the person he just met. She asked why not. What if he was a spy for the Demon King who infiltrated the academy disguised as an ordinary student? Otherwise, she wouldn't understand why you were sitting here alone late at night. They exchanged glances, and he thought, the one who was also here said, it seemed like there was no reason. He asked, then why was she here? Pointing her finger at him, she asked, wasn't it obvious? She went out to practice. He said that he was doing his exercises too. She asked, what kind? He replied, breathing. Puzzled, she asked, huh? Looking at Abel's wounded hands, he thought, these wounds. Then she hid her hands with a sharp movement, and he watched this silently. He said that she works hard. She answered, well, of course, people have no idea what it means to bear the name Nibelung. She must be perfect at all times and in everything. And if she shows even a hint of weakness, everyone will immediately pounce on her like hungry dogs. She smiled shyly and said that on the one hand, she felt relieved, and on the other, she was overcome with curiosity. Who could surpass her? How she wanted to know the name of this person. The protagonist's eyes widened, and she said that next time she would smear him against the wall. Smiling awkwardly, he asked why go so far? Indignantly, she shouted, it's a matter of her pride. She begged him to tell her grandfather everything, and he replied that the student wasn't even in her class. Not only that, he had the nerve to skip the oath ceremony. How could she possibly accept second place after that? Then she smiled awkwardly and said, oh my God, why did she decide to pour out her soul to a stranger? He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye and asked, really, why? She chuckled, then looked at him and said that it was probably because he looked weak. Being firm with the strong and warm with the weak was her family's motto. She looked at the stars and said that all of her classmates were very boring, so she had no friends. Kama thought, so that's why the female lead was so distant. She then flexed her arms and said that it was time to go to bed. He looked at her and said, bye then. She was silent for a while, then stood up and, putting her hands on her hips, shyly shouted, so he would tell her his name? He replied that he didn't want to. She exclaimed, hey. After a while, the male lead was sitting in the classroom. He realized that his life at the academy was much calmer than he expected. Chloe quickly made friends with everyone and blended in, while he studiously avoided meeting her, not even making eye contact. When they did cross paths, her new friends looked at him with cold indifference. However, he didn't care about their disdainful looks, since he was a student with a special pass. Besides, he wasn't the only special student in this tiger class. There were only a few of them, and they were reluctant to communicate with each other. He supposed it was due to self-esteem. Putting his fist to his mouth, he realized with pleasure that he didn't belong to the upper class, since this was the period when the Star and Dragon classes formed political factions. Even during the game, he felt like there were too many clowns there. And if he were in one of those classes now, even thinking about it would be unbearable. At least he was eating well now. So what to eat today? He remembered Media smilingly handing him the card and telling him that due to his status as a top student, he should have been given this card much earlier. She apologized for the wait. He looked at the faculty card in his hands and thought that even bowing to the academy director 3 times a day would not be enough to express his gratitude. Sudden idolization. Thank him very much. He was doing his duties as a student well, right? It did not have a significant impact on the main scenario. Standing up from his chair, he said, great. All he had to do was bring the same for the next 3 years. And then, smiling, he thought that he could achieve the future he imagined. After some time, the teacher said 700 years ago, when the first war between humans and demons broke out, the hero Joaquin Valor realized that it was necessary to raise the next generation of heroes. He founded this academy, which began to teach 7 disciplines. This will also be on their exam, so they should remember it well. Sitting at his desk, the protagonist leaned his head on his hand and thought that he knew more or less. The founding hero Joaquin Valor fought the right hand of the Demon King and the commander of the First Legion, Legion, for 20 years to the death and eventually emerged victorious. However, Joaquin lost his hand and could no longer participate in battles. Screams filled the air around him. It was a bloody war with no clear winner. Fortunately, humans and demons decided to take a break right in the middle of the main battle. That's when the hero Joaquin founded the academy to raise the future generation. The teacher explained that the first war between humans and demons ended with a non-aggression pact that was concluded for the next 700 years. One of the students asked if a war would happen in their time. His neighbor chuckled in response, "A war in the 21st century? He's more worried about what to wear to a party tomorrow, haha." The protagonist thought about 700 years of peace, but he knew that the schism was just around the corner. It was no wonder that everyone had gotten used to a peaceful existence. As much as he wanted to tell the dean about the future that had happened, he knew what consequences it could lead to. Although she now openly says that she wants to leave her post as soon as possible, he remembered how she offered him to go with her far, far away. Media was the first person in history who sensed that something was wrong, and she was also one of the 7 heroes who stood up to protect the students. Although he did not finish the game, he managed to see the spoilers. Media was the first victim of the Demon King. Back when he was working as a cook, he scrolled through the information on the game and saw that she was going to die. If he did not know this now, then. The teacher interrupted his thoughts and said that it was all for today. They should study hard for the exam that was in 2 weeks. The students were leaving the classroom and saying, "Wow, that's beautiful. Damn, is this true?" One of them, looking at the exit, asked, "What's going on there? Is he with him?" Kama looked at him in surprise and thought, "But what's going on there?" Hearing the cry, "Is that him?" he looked at the date on his phone in surprise and said, "May 5th. "That's right, today." A group of students gathered near the entrance, and someone said indignantly, "He's not going to be in their class, right?" "Dude, he's definitely going to be in the stars class." The protagonist thought that if his memory serves him right, the protagonist Leon van Rijkaard is enrolling on May 5th. And the long 700 years of peace will show its first crack. An annoying fool, his face is a real cliché, and all the girls and women who play this game immediately fall in love with him. If this were a game for adults, Kama thought it would be a good idea. Leon would have died before the battle with the Demon King. Besides, he is literally surrounded by charming female characters: Rachel Demura, the saint's niece, with a spear; Saki Ryojo, the saint's daughter, with a bow; Abel von Nibelung, the emperor's granddaughter, with a sword. Overall, the protagonist's squad is impressive. It's very annoying, but in 3 years, Leon Reinhardt, blessed with miracles, will be one of the first to be drafted into the army. To tell the truth, he is even happy about the prospect of ending up in hell. You can't drag him there a second time. And it's no different from forced military service. He definitely can't get out of it. By the way, Valor Joaquin was only able to defeat the commander of the First Legion. How strong is the Demon King then? Is this one of those stories where the protagonist is defeated at the end of the game? Leon, who was talking to the students at the time, suddenly turned his attention to Calm and smiled. The protagonist thought, right. They are talking about the blessing of miracles. Yeah, the protagonist can handle it just fine on his own. Kama thought that Leon had the face of a man who had it written on his forehead that he could be trusted. Even he fell for it. Chloe turned to him and said, "I'm sorry." After a while, in the training hall, the protagonist was training with a stick in his hands. Sighing, he looked at the siding on his hands and thought, if he took a weapon that did not meet the standards, the blessing would not appear. You need to pay with a certain level of fencing. In the corridor of the academy, Chloe came up to him and, apologizing, asked, did she do something wrong? He thought he almost lost his head. He should tell her, but they still had a whole year to study together. He smiled and said that everything was fine. She asked, really? He confirmed her words and thought that he needed to be friendly. He did not need enemies now. She looked away and shyly pressed her hands to her chest, saying what a relief. He thought, who is she? She held the sword tightly in her hands even though she was unconscious. A sword filled with sadness. It seemed like the surroundings were begging for help. However, the blade was screaming with the desire to kill. If this girl was capable of killing, then she could be much more dangerous than the Mao brothers. Then she apologized again and asked if it was okay to invite him to dinner tonight. He was surprised and asked again, huh? She explained that she wanted to thank him, but she wasn't as good a cook as he was, so. Remembering the past evenings together, he thought, dinner? Then he looked at her pleading eyes and thought, God, these puppy eyes, it's embarrassing to refuse. But he had a strong feeling that if he agreed now, he might wake up in someone else's refrigerator in the morning. Oh, right, he said, Chloe, but instead of dinner, could he ask her for a favor? She specified, a favor? He confirmed her words and said that he could only rely on her. Confused, she asked her, what kind of request did he have? Awkwardly scratching the back of his head, he asked if she could teach him fencing. He thought that he needed a teacher anyway and came up with a good excuse. Chloe was delighted. From that day on, he looked up various articles about fencing every night before going to bed. He thought he had found enough information. Some time later, in the training hall, Chloe shouted, "Kama." Coming closer and looking at him with a loving gaze, she asked when he arrived. She asked for him nearby. Holding a stick in his hands, he said, "Chloe, he just arrived, and she?" Smiling happily, she replied that she had just arrived too. He asked what time? She replied, 6:30. He awkwardly asked, "Didn't they agree on 8?" She smiled sheepishly and scratched her head awkwardly. He wondered what it was. Then she looked away sheepishly and asked, "Is something wrong?" He said, No. He hadn't noticed it while she was in her school uniform, but now her abs and muscles were clearly visible. Now it made sense why she was so strong. How cute, something like that was appreciated. Then he handed her a stick and told her to take it. Taking it in her hands, she asked, "Huh? Aren't they going to use real swords?" He wondered if he misheard. Chloe was going to use bladed weapons? This wasn't a fight to the death. He said it was just training. And to avoid getting hurt, you need to use wooden swords. Uncomfortably scratching her head again, she said, good-natured. Lost in thought, she looked at the stick and then swung it and cut the air in front of her. The protagonist's face began to sweat, and he wondered, just how strong was she? Just went and cut the air. You need to be more careful. Finally a blessing. A system window appeared in front of him, which said, "Blessing of the Sword God, cuts in 1 hit, physical level 2 to 5. Sword characteristics are relaxed. Mental level 3. Active participation is not required. Armament level 1. Release conditions are unknown. Synchronization frequency 2%. Pointing his finger forward, he thought, just to make sure, okay, the sword characteristics are fine, there is physical growth. Well, can this be called a blessing? Usually it increases along with the level of mastery. And are there any additional effects? He did not remember any. Well, how much stronger does he have to become so that normal text appears instead of these questions? She awkwardly called him and asked, "Is something wrong?" He looked at her and, apologizing, thought that perhaps only he saw this window. He probably looked like a fool staring into space. He said that today was their first lesson, and she should be gentle with him. But she replied with an awkward smile, "Oh, okay." He tightened his grip on the stick and asked, "Well then, shall they begin?" He thought back to his past lives and realized that he had always been a practical person. As the saying goes, seeing is believing. To become a master of something, it is not enough to simply devote time and effort to it, you must be prepared to sacrifice your entire body. The fact that he had quickly settled into the academy was a result of the skills he had acquired in his past lives. Closing his eyes, he thought about his sweaty palms and his unsteady posture. However, the essence of fencing is to deliver precise blows to your opponent. Opening his eyes, he saw Chloe rushing towards him, swinging her stick. He wondered, why did she do that all of a sudden? The next moment, the stick flew past his head. He watched it and thought, damn. He asked her to be gentle. He waved his hand, and she raised the stick in front of her again. Kama held the stick above his head and his body shook. He thought, how heavy! But he blocked the attack. He will strike from above. However, at this time, Chloe had already jumped into the air and swung. He thought, when will she? Damn! Is she going to attack even faster? Was the previous attack just a test? He blocked her attack with his stick and a crack appeared on the stick. His feet slid on the floor and he thought, she is not going to stop. She continued to strike, and he tried to defend himself. Gritting his teeth, he thought, how heavy these strikes are. If he misses even one, this world will die. He is almost at his limit. There is no way to control the situation. At this moment, part of the stick flew to the side, and only half was left in his hands. Seeing this, Chloe said that she was sorry. She tried to hold back, but she could not. Hearing nothing in response, she asked, Kama? A system window appeared in front of him, saying, Prerequisite met. Weapon damaged error. Initiating user personality adjustment using forced force. Humanity level lowered. Sword God's blessing. Heat activated. In an instant, Kama found himself in a snow-white space that seemed to be made of pixels. He was wearing a chef's uniform. Looking around, he asked in confusion, where was he? In the kitchen? Was this a dream? Oh right, he was cooking fish. He couldn't wait to get back to work. Maybe he should take the Chinese chef's knife today? It had been lying around and used for a long time. However, when he tried to use the knife, a system window appeared in front of him with the message error, this item cannot be used. Kama asked in confusion, what is this? Why can't I take it? Then he will use this. But this item was also unavailable. He remembered being told not to worry, and just do his job. Looking at the sashimi knife, he said, well, then that only leaves the sashimi knife. This was the knife he was supposed to take. Surprisingly, even holding it was unbearably painful. The system asked, and now? Putting the knife to the fish's head, Kama noticed with surprise, huh? For some reason, the pain went away. He even felt inspired somehow. The system answered, yes, that's right. This is how he should have been standing all this time. From the darkness above, huge hands appeared, their fingers tied with strings, controlling the protagonist like a puppet. Kama exclaimed, the heat was activated. Looking at him with concern, Chloe asked, Kama, is he okay? Receiving no answer, she continued to repeat his name. The protagonist, whose silhouette appeared through the curtain of smoke, shifted from foot to foot. A trace of his bright eye remained in the air. The next moment, he rushed forward with lightning speed. Chloe put her stick in front of her and blocked the blow with difficulty. She clenched her teeth and shouted, Kama. He must wait. But he did not wait a second. Another blow, and Chloe was thrown to the side. She gritted her teeth again, thinking that he was different. She dodged another blow. The protagonist's eyes were shining brightly as he looked at her. She thought that he had thrown her away with the attack. Rising to her feet, her body was shaking, she held onto the stick and put her other hand on her stomach. It was hard for her to even move, and she did not understand what was happening to him. It was necessary to end the fight. With her last strength, she suggested that he stop. But he did not pay attention to her words and rushed at her again, swinging his stick. She thought that she would not be able to dodge, and repeating his name, asked him to wake up. When his weapon was very close to her, she cried out his name with tears in her eyes. At this time in the game, the protagonist asked in surprise, what is this? The tail of the fish seemed to escape the tip of his sword, and he wondered why the fish was dodging? He had never seen anything like this before. Dodged again? How fast? God, this is so annoying, he needs to get this over with. He turned his attention to the wriggling fish and said, is this trying to say something? Is he hallucinating? Omjiam? Majiam? Kama? The protagonist said, oh right, he is Kama. So it was that. The next moment, his vision returned to normal and he saw Chloe screaming at him to wake up. He threw his weapon forward and she looked up at him with teary eyes. Taking her hand, he suggested that they call it a day. She asked confusedly, what? And then asked if he was okay? He turned towards the exit and thanked her for helping him practice. He would leave. She watched him go, and then, as she walked down the street, she thought, if she compared his strength in the placement test now, then there was something strange about Kama. This wasn't skill, it was something completely unbridled. Even though his blessing had been unconscious, she was still no match for him. And they hadn't trained with real swords. She knew he was strong, but Nox's auditor was leaning against the wall in her way. He said she seemed delighted. She looked at him seriously, and he looked at her and said, Chloe. She said, brother? He adjusted his mask and said, so that's what she's been doing since joining the academy? Hanging out with scum? Chloe remained silent, and then, coming a little closer, asked him not to call Kama that. He asked, so his name was Kama? If she kept hanging around with him, someone from the auditor family would have to get rid of him. She closed her eyes and then, walking past him, said, let everyone come, they can't handle him. Nox thoughtfully placed his fingers on the mask on his face and said, Kama? Kama wanted to make it clear that the power he had received was not a divine blessing and was not a blessing. Rather, it was like a curse. In order not to rely on the blessing of the sword god, he needed to find a new weapon. But this power seemed to mock him and haunt him, eventually taking over his body. He was even more. No, it was not just gone, only feelings of pleasure and sweet exhaustion remained. This curse controlled him like a puppet. And whispered sweet words, cut more, cut deeper less often, destroy more extensively. He gave up his body, but at that moment Chloe's scream mixed with despair, and the name he remembered, Kama, rang out. Then the screams converged, and the pieces of the previously collapsed world fell into place. That was why he was able to throw away the training sword that had managed to stick to him like a second skin. It seemed to him that a few more seconds, and he would lose his self forever. Recently, the yandere who tried to kill him, Chloe, was finally able to return his consciousness to reality. And although she is the reason why he ended up in this state, in the end he now feels grateful. He decided to demonstratively ignore what happened, but still ran away in a hurry to avoid a possible repeat of the manifestation of the sword god's blessing. However, will he be able to run like this for the rest of his life? The sword god's blessing is a talent close to a curse, and it manifests itself when one sacrifices one's life. It was as if he became an outsider thrown into a world where he will have to use the skills he learned in the future. He did not expect much from this world. He just wanted to live a normal life. He thought he could handle all the problems that came his way, but only now did he finally realize what was happening. There was something in his body that was trying to take over his mind. The powers he had received were not a blessing, but a curse, ready to swallow him up at any moment. A very contradictory divine power. 3 days later. Sitting in the classroom, Chloe turned her gaze to a classmate who said with a smile, "Yesterday was so great. She should try too." Chloe agreed, yes, she would definitely go later. Then, looking away from her classmate, she thought about the fact that Kama had been absent from class for 3 days since that incident. She glanced at the empty table and realized that she didn't even know his number. And why hadn't she asked him for it before? She even went to the dorm to his room, but all she could hear was painful groans from inside. Afraid that he would get angry, she resisted the urge to smash the door. In the end, she had no choice but to turn around and leave. She didn't even know how many times a day she glanced at him, afraid to impose herself. She always spoke to him with special caution. At first, she thought that all these feelings arose because he stood up for her, but perhaps these were just excuses. She said that she missed him. The next day, Wonbin, the teacher, shouted at the entire audience, "Silence! Shut up! Is this all the students of a prestigious school can do? Today, due to bad weather conditions, their training will be replaced by self-study." Looking around the audience, the teacher thought that Kama had not shown up today either. This boy would not skip classes without a good reason. He, the teacher, can only hope and wait. Then the students shouted, "Study!" "Yes!" Wonbin indignantly shouted, "Who is so brave to show up in the middle of class?" His eyes widened in surprise when he saw Kama coming down the stairs. Chloe exclaimed in surprise, "Kama?" The protagonist's face showed no emotion. Turning to the professor, he apologized for being late. Wonbin said, "It's okay, he can sit down." The students began to whisper among themselves, wasn't he a special student? Had he always looked like this? Did she think? It seemed like he had gotten a little prettier, no? After the class ended, all the students headed for the exit. One of them shouted to his comrade that it was time to eat. He was going to die of hunger. His interlocutor asked in surprise, "That much?" Chloe awkwardly folded her hands in front of her and said, confused, "Kama?" He stood with his arms folded across his chest and looked in the opposite direction. He asked, "Yes, Chloe?" She asked, "Did something happen to him?" He said that it wasn't like that, nothing like that. She said he hadn't shown up for a few days and she thought something was wrong. Was it because of that training? He turned to her and said he was just really sick. "Thank you for worrying about him." She looked at him with a loving gaze and then looked at him sideways and said, "If that's the case, then fine." He thought her doubts were understandable. He had been suffering from extremely severe withdrawal symptoms for the last 3 days and had eventually driven himself to complete mental exhaustion. Locked in his room, unable to even eat or drink, he lay in bed and prayed for the cramps to finally subside. Yes, the price for holding a broken weapon in his hands was too much. It was beyond the unbearable pain he had experienced before. However, it didn't end there. Looking in the mirror, he realized that although his body was the same, his facial expression had changed dramatically and part of his hair had turned white. He was sure that this was his punishment. She probably felt guilty. After all, Chloe was his last rival. He needed to fix that. He asked if she remembered inviting him to dinner. "Maybe tonight?" she asked, surprised, "Huh? What? Was he serious? Dinner?" He confirmed his words and said that this time she would be cooking. Chloe jumped up and down, spreading her arms out to the sides, joyfully exclaimed, "Of course." She would try her best. So exciting. The protagonist, looking at her, thought that she seemed to have perked up. Then she happily folded her arms across her chest and said, "Well then, today she will cook whatever he wants." What did he like? He said that he had long wanted to eat fish. After the last time, that is, fish was expensive, so he did not eat it anymore. Suddenly, it seemed like something pierced him. Turning to the side, he saw marks on the plant and thought, what? He saw Nox, who, with his arms folded across his chest, was watching them. His eyes seemed to have no pupils, and through the mask you could see the outline of his smile. Chloe looked at her brother in horror, and the protagonist asked, does she know him? There was no answer, but the boys met each other's eyes. Coming closer, he said that if he had something to say, he should say it. Silently staring at others was indecent. Nox's eyes lit up red. Kama thought, what's wrong with his eyes? Chloe shouted at Kama to just ignore him. Nox is her brother. She asked him not to come. The protagonist looked at her and thought, brother? Really? She shouted indignantly, why is he here? Kama thought that even though she tried to speak confidently, he could hear a tremor in her voice. Nox said that this man was too weak. So she intends to be friends with someone who is not even able to follow the rules of the academy, Chloe? She shouted that the auditor no longer has anything to do with her. Nox shouted that her hands were already covered in blood up to the elbows. Once an auditor was born, she would remain one forever. Kama thought that his sister spoke a subculture, and his brother an ancient language. The main thing is that they do not overdo it. Nox indignantly shouted, enough hanging out with him, Chloe, she must finally return to the auditor. She bit her lip and shouted that he did not dare to talk about Kama like that. The protagonist thought, is it impossible to peacefully coexist? They were just going to eat. Although he had already managed to get used to this. No, wait a minute, auditor? Right, now I understand. He begins to remember something. A shadow group that appears only in the middle of the game. In the main genre of hiding and killing, it was said that they are inferior to other hero houses in open battles, but in ambush tactics they have no equal. Their children are subjected to excruciating training, after which they become excellent tools for killing. Members of this family are certainly very strong. So Chloe was one of them. Wait, normalizing deviation? How could such a face be considered normal? He would kill without thinking, and this was clear just from his gaze. This was understandable, because the auditor eliminated enemies from within to maintain order. Well, now he himself was in a position where he would probably have to be killed soon. So there was no point in despising others for taking a life. Then he looked at Chloe. Her body was shaking, and blood appeared on her lips from the force with which she bit them. He thought, Chloe, it seems like she wants to live a normal life. But like the blessing of the sword god, once she was born, her family could not allow her to do whatever she wanted. The life of a cold-blooded and emotionless killer is always full of cruelty. He is not a hero, and does not strive to be one, but... Smirking, he wondered, what is he doing? He decided that if he couldn't save the whole world, he could at least help one girl. Walking a little forward, he said that he would go and talk to him. He understood that this power could not be denied, although it was more like a curse. This power would not let him lose. He asked, was his name Nox? And he realized that no matter how he tried to escape from this power, it would not work. Nox nodded, and the protagonist remembered the words from one manhwa, the place where a person goes is not heaven. And he agreed with that. Since running won't work, he will have to go on the attack. His name is Kankama. Passing Nox, he said, follow him. He should not lag behind. He is a master of the sword. After a while, in the teacher's lounge, Wonbin was sitting at his desk with his hands folded in front of him. He thought that something seemed to have happened to that boy. His face, which seemed to have all the emotion sucked out of it, was worrying. At that moment, a girl entered the room with a drink in her hand and happily exclaimed, Senior. Eh? What's wrong with him? Even the hair on his head seemed to be less than usual. He looked at her angrily and told her not to mess with his hair. She laughed and apologized. Then the teacher picked up the phone and said that this was the head of the homeroom, Wonbin. Watching this, the girl took a sip of her drink and thought that it wasn't the hair, although he always walked around with that thing, although he looked cute. Wonbin asked, yes, what is it? What? Subspace? Now? Who requested it, and who is the opponent? He was told that the request was made by Kama, and the opponent was Nox Auditor. The instructor asked in surprise, what? Kama is sitting in the room and thinking that there are 15 minutes left before the fight. It seemed to him that the process of organizing the subspace would be long, but it happened quite quickly. He remembered how Medius said that if he really went for it, then he should be more careful. Kama thought that the fight would take place outside this reality anyway, so there would be no physical injuries, but moral ones are quite possible. He said with a serious face that if he wins, it will all be over. The sounds reach even the waiting room. It is quite possible that watching someone else's fight is interesting, but he did not expect such a violent reaction from the audience. Although he himself is good, he did not want to attract unnecessary attention to himself, but in the end. Suddenly Chloe couldn't take it anymore and called out to the main character with tears in her eyes. Kama thought that it seems she thinks that all this is because of her. He said with an excited smile that it is not her fault. He pulled out a shiny knife and said with a smile on his face that besides, he borrowed her weapon, so everything will be fine. Chloe said sadly that her brother was strong. Kama stood up and said that he was also quite strong. She said fearfully that he was a genius who inherited the powers of the family. He has no equal. At 14 years old he was already called the pinnacle of the night technique. Kama thought with a serious face that he was the pinnacle of the night technique? And who even gives such names? If you think about it, it was always like this, no matter how much he avoided such skirmishes. In the end, he would have been dragged into it anyway. The protagonist remembered that his former boss said that he was destined to hold a knife in his hands all his life. He thought that he probably could not imagine that even in another life he would use a sashimi knife. Suddenly, the loudspeaker said that the formation of the subspace was beginning, so they asked everyone to go to the arena. Kama stood up and confidently told Chloe that he would be right back. She excitedly agreed and started to get very nervous. The protagonist called out to her with a smile on his face and said that there were many geniuses in the world, but he would still win. After a while, the protagonist entered the arena, holding 2 knives in his hands. The stands were shouting that they believed in him, let him do it, there had been no fights like this for a long time. Kama thought with a smile on his face that it was like a gladiator fight in Rome, he didn't know that it would be like this. Suddenly he noticed the upper class in the stands and wondered if they had nothing better to do? They were only putting extra pressure on his poor head. Suddenly Nox appeared and with a wild face, calling out to the protagonist, asked why he dared to mock him? It seemed that he couldn't tell the difference between courage and arrogance. How could he dare to use such a ridiculous weapon in a real battle? Kama thought that he needed to try to survive. He said that usually the pros don't blame the weapon. Nox with a furious face said that in that case, he would let his insolent tongue be cut off first. Kama thought about the fact that he had 2 swords, the Scarlet Wheel. He even put on one of the highest defensive spells, the Raven Armor. He immediately felt it, he had an S-rank weapon. It seemed like a joke, but he thought he was serious. The protagonist took out his weapons, the Daiso Sashimi knife and Chloe's rose dagger. The loudspeaker shouted that the space was declared open. May the hero's blessing be with them. They attacked each other. Kama used the blessing of painlessness and the blessing of the sword god. May the power of the gods be with them. The people from the stands asked in confusion, isn't this just a fight? Rachel, watching their fight, said with admiration that they are very fast. Abel wondered how the student she thought was weak could fight like that. The protagonist and Nox were attacking and both were blocking. He wondered excitedly that they would see if he could dodge it. Nox used the 3-legged bird skill and attacked the protagonist with lightning speed. He wondered if he had finished him off for sure. Suddenly, he saw Kama deftly dodge his attack. In the stands, a man said that the first-year student was doing nothing but running from his senior. The second year was much stronger, right? The second man said that he shouldn't underestimate the difference in a year. Abel wondered no, if you look closely, everything becomes clear at once. Even though the second year was attacking hard, the first year managed to block them all, as if he didn't want to fight. Nox wondered excitedly that Chloe was right, he wasn't that simple. Now it was clear to him, this boy was using defense. It's no wonder he manages to escape attacks alive. He's too fast, with skills like his, he should be more careful. He needs to focus on a powerful attack with a large area of effect, but looking at his weapon, he becomes increasingly angry. Kama threw away one knife and took a stance, aiming at the enemy. Nox was confused, thinking that he threw the knife in the middle of a fight? He asked, what is he going to do? Seeing the protagonist's fighting stance, Nox was confused, thinking that he was crazy, he was going to attack from such a pose? A talentless man is going to do such a stupid thing. He took out 2 swords and said that he will finish him off with one blow. Nox thought that no one can resist his scarlet wheel. The protagonist moved towards him with lightning speed. Kama thought that he just wanted a quiet life. He remembered being told that he didn't need to stand out, let him be ordinary. All days are the same, he needs to protect his body, there's something inside him. He must protect himself, if he can't escape, Then he will fight together with the blessing of the gods. Let him cut. In an instant, Nox's hand flew off and fell to the ground. He thought with wild fear that he didn't even see his attack. With lightning speed, the protagonist appeared behind him. He thought with a serious face that it didn't matter to him whether it was a blessing or a curse. He was saying goodbye to his calm future. The loudspeaker said that the subspace was finishing its work, the fight was over. Kama put the knife in its sheath and thought that the audience had some strange reaction. Now he definitely wouldn't be able to turn back. He looked at his weapon and thought that he was fighting with a fish knife. Of course, he assumed so, but piercing a person with it is not a pleasant thing. The only consolation is that the fight took place in subspace. No one was hurt in the end. This is really an amazing thing. Nox is really not a weakling, everything is as Chloe said. He felt that he had a lot of experience in fighting, but with such a lifestyle, people would never reach out to him. This is immediately noticeable, and yet, he is strong. The winner is a first-year student, Kama. Loud questions were heard from the stands. What is this special student from the first year? He defeated a second year. The main character thought that this would definitely add to his popularity. He said that what is done, because he himself chose to survive, relying on anger. After a while, people in the audience were talking about yesterday's fight. One of the people said that this is so, but even such a strong one lost to Kama. Abel, sitting at her desk and looking out the window, thought that the name of this first year is Kama. Wherever she goes, everyone only talks about yesterday, although there is really something to discuss. She remembered how the protagonist had cut off Nox's hand in a flash and thought that after that, she herself couldn't look away. It seemed too unrealistic, especially since he had only used 2 kitchen knives. She was proud to be the granddaughter of a sword master and thought that she was well versed in weapons, but it seemed she was wrong. Is it really possible to be so strong even with ordinary knives? Abel remembered how she, sitting next to the protagonist, asked that she was overcome by curiosity, who was able to surpass her. How she wanted to know the name of this person, so that next time she could smear him against the wall. Perhaps it was because he looked weak. Being firm with the strong and kind-hearted with the weak, that was her family's motto. She remembered her father saying that he also didn't know who won first place. It suddenly dawned on Abel that this was the main character. She got really angry and thought that it turned out that he was stronger than her. What was he thinking when he looked at her? What? She aggressively slammed her hands on the desk and shouted, what was going on in his head? Rachel asked in confusion, what happened to her? Abel calmed down and said with a smile on her face that it was nothing. Rachel with a smile on her face asked if it was true or if there was something. Abel said that she just didn't have time to train for a couple of days, that's why she flared up. She looked at her and said that her face said something completely different. Abel angrily asked what was wrong with her face. Rachel with a calm smile told her to tell her everything. She asked, what does she want to eat? Did she forget her weapon at home? Does she really need to go to the toilet? Abel said no to all her questions. Rachel asked with a smile that she had a boyfriend. Abel blushed deeply and said nothing to her question. Rachel grinned and asked with a wild smile that it was true? So she was a girl after all, she knew it. Abel cried out with great embarrassment that it was not so. She calmed down and asked with a smile on her face who this handsome man was? Since she was hiding him, he was obviously unusual. The guy she liked was Leon? Well, he was really cute. Abel said with a serious face that no, it was not him. Rachel smiled and asked that in that case, was he that special student from yesterday's fight? Abel blushed deeply and turned away from her. Rachel with a wild smile thought that this was bingo, today was a beautiful day. She grabbed her hand and said that they had to go. Abel asked in confusion where they were going. Rachel with a smile on her face said that they were going to the tiger class. After a while they came to class and Rachel, holding her hand, shouted that she was asking them to forgive her. She confidently approached the table, stood on it, and said that he would look where their dark-haired one was. She asked where that black-haired guy was. A man came up to her and said that it was indecent to stand on someone else's table with your feet. Rachel winked at him and said that she was a beauty, so let him forgive her once. The man blushed deeply and agreed. Rachel saw the main character and noticed that Chloe was sitting next to him. She wondered if this was his girlfriend. She didn't care, it was even better this way, because it would be much more interesting. She approached the main character, climbed onto his table and asked that he was Kama? She saw him yesterday at the duel. He wondered why she was here. Rachel extended her finger to his face and said that if you looked closely, he was very handsome. Kama was very confused, thinking that everything inside him was literally screaming that he needed to stay away. Chloe came up to her with red eyes, grabbed her hand and asked with a serious face, "Who is she?" The protagonist thought that the danger he had just felt came from Chloe. In this state, she is completely different. She took out a stationary knife and looked at Rachel with a furious face. Kama thought that this was a massacre right in the classroom. This definitely did not happen in the game. What is going on? Suddenly Abel came up to her and, grabbing Rachel by the hand, asked what she was doing in someone else's class. She turned around and asked with a smile on her face, that they just came to say hello, right? Rachel patted Chloe on the head and with a smile on her face told her not to interfere when adults are talking. And also, a knife is not a toy for children, it is better for her to put it down. Chloe with a furious face took out the blade, stabbed and told her to die. At this time, other students at another desk pierced the tomato juice package. One of them shouted in displeasure that everything leaked out. What kind of bad packaging was this? The second man said that this was the only way he would pay attention to him. At this time, Rachel instantly grabbed Chloe's hand and with a smile on her face asked that it was too slow. It seemed to her that she was not only short in height, but also her speed was lame. Abel shouted in displeasure for her to stop. Rachel with a calm face threw Chloe out with a slight movement of her hand. She did a somersault and landed deftly on the floor. Kama was perplexed and thought that they were crazy. A song about prosperity. Then the clan of the predominance of strength, whose motto is no skills are needed in front of overwhelming force. The niece of the saint with the spear, the class star, Rachel. She approached the protagonist and asked with a smile on her face that this little girl was his girlfriend. Kama said with a serious face that no, she was not his girlfriend. He thought about it, it got cold, but she really wasn't his girlfriend. He said that Chloe was just a friend. Kama thought about what was going on here. Even Abel was here, he didn't notice her right away. He asked with a serious face, why were they looking for him? Rachel said with a smile on her face that Abel was interested in him, that's why they came to see each other. She blushed deeply and shouted, when did it happen? Rachel turned around in bewilderment and asked, isn't that why they were here? Abel shouted that she dragged her here by force. Rachel said that she thought that she wanted this herself, that's why she followed her so obediently. Abel calmed down and said with slight embarrassment that it seemed like there was a misunderstanding, she didn't plan to come. The protagonist thought that in that case, she could have just left. He said that if they didn't have anything urgent then let them go. Rachel grabbed his hand and said with a smile on her face that he was funny, she liked guys like that. Kama said with a displeased face that thank God he was not one of them. She asked with a playful smile that how about going to her place after school and watching a movie? Chloe aggressively yelled at her to get away from her Kama right now. Rachel laughed loudly at her words, turned to Abel and asked that she heard that. Seeing that she was very angry, Rachel said that she was to see him. Kama said with a displeased face that she shouldn't come anymore. She chuckled with a smile on her face and said that it was rude. Moving away, Rachel turned around again and said goodbye to him smilingly. The main character thought about her to get lost as soon as possible. He again buried his face in his desk and said that he really wanted to sleep. At this time, Abel turned in his direction, looked and silently left. After some time, they walked down the corridor. Rachel, with a smile on her face, thought that everything turned out interesting. His cold-bloodedness is understandable, but there is something dark about those dark eyes, as if her neck was cut. He is definitely different from those windbags who study here. She came there just to have fun, but unexpectedly found something interesting. Her clan has been marrying only outstanding warriors for several decades, so at least this Kama is very attractive. However, the guy is quite worthy of the attention of the unapproachable empress. Rachel, with a smile on her face, turned towards Abel and apologized. She said discontentedly that she did not need to apologize to her, but to the guys from his class. Rachel said that no, she did not mean that. She will not be able to give up Kama to her. After some time, Nox walks down the corridor holding N4 in his hands. He thought with an aggressive face that he would kill him. In his entire life, this body had never encountered defeat, the body of the great auditor family. Will everything change with the coming of night? Is there a need to penetrate the protagonist at this time? He pushed away the man who passed by and aggressively shouted for him to go away. Nox thought that he needed to gather the entire family. Then he would definitely be able to deprive this arrogant brat of his head. He would get rid of him and take Chloe. She was as strong and dangerous as he was, if not more. That's right, he needed to sort everything out right now. With the power of his family and his night technique, he would definitely cope. Knox opened the door to the ward and stood in a strong stupor, because inside the room sat the protagonist and gnawed an apple. After a while, Chloe sat at her workplace in the audience and bit her nails out of anger. The protagonist was also sitting in the audience. He looked at her and thought that she seemed offended, although she herself took out the knife. She looked at the stationary knife and thought, so she is normal? Even, after this she will not live. He addressed her by name, which distracted her from her crazy thoughts. Suddenly, her face completely changed and asked him, addressing him by name, what was wrong? He thought that she would at least let go of the knife. He awkwardly asked her if she knew how Knox was feeling. She did not expect such a question, so she thought about it. After that, she said that her brother was hospitalized in the academy hospital. He said, did not understand, then he asked again, was he hospitalized? But in the subspace, it is impossible to get hurt. She lowered her gaze and said that, to be honest, she did not visit him, so she did not even know about it. He didn't seem to be hurt in any way, but she heard rumors that he was in the hospital. She smiled and said that he would definitely be fine, so he didn't have to worry. He thought that even though he had attacked back then, he didn't think that his mental state would be so unstable. What a shame for him. He hoped that Knox wasn't up to anything there. He walked closer to her and asked her with a smile if she would tell him which room her brother was in. He patted her head and thought that the first rule was to pat her head first, according to the Neotube Saki source. She was embarrassed and couldn't put words together. After a while, he reached his room and saw him. Knox yelled at him in anger. The protagonist was holding an apple in his hands at that moment and asked if he could eat it. He yelled that he already had it. Asked, it seems like his family has a lot of money? Knox remained silent and listened nervously. He looked around with an apple in his hands and said that this was a single room. It was really amazing. His interlocutor screamed in indignation, how did he get there? The protagonist reached for the knife at that moment. Knox thought, did he really come to him to finish what he started? He took the knife and began to panic with the other one. He simply began to peel the apple. Knox was very surprised by this and thought that he was doing it so well that he was in shock. Put a plate with a perfectly peeled apple on his bedside table. He said that since he had no appetite, let him at least eat some fruit. Knox suspected something and thought, pulling a knife out of his sleeve, how dare he doubt his skills? He would finish him off right now. At that moment, came out of the room and said that he just remembered that if he was thinking about revenge on him, he would destroy their entire family. Knox was very surprised by this. The protagonist cut the apple into slices with a sharp movement and slammed the door behind him. Knox fell to the floor in surprise and tried to recover. After a while, was walking down the street. He thought that he had only slightly frightened him, but apparently he was truly morally broken. Only because of this, his threat worked. The Auditor is the only clan of assassins in this world. He wanted to destroy them all. Unfortunately, he needed to deal with everyone in 30 seconds, during which he can hold a weapon. It is not at all realistic. Although it is quite possible to finish off at least 10 people during this time, and yet this is the most extreme option. He needs to try to solve everything in a different way. He looked at the moon and was silent. He thought that he had a feeling as if he was standing face to face with a snowstorm. It seemed like this was becoming a habit for him. He said that now he was finally worth something. He thought that Knox was no longer dangerous, he could forget about him now. But the problem was the one he least wanted to deal with, Rachel. He wasn't going to have anything to do with her. In the game, she stuck to the main character, but in the end, Abel overtook her. He would think about it later, but now it was time for him to study for the midterm. Still, the reward was really worth it, he should take it more seriously. He took out his phone to check his plans for the next few days, and thought that Murasame was a sword. He needed a weapon that would allow him to fight for more than 30 seconds. He paused and thought that this exam, regardless of class, was conducted in the following manner. 5 people fought using magic. Of course, the ability of an individual student was important, but the exam was still conducted in a team battle format, because in times of war, trust and teamwork were simply irreplaceable. Although he doesn't like working with anyone, if he can gather a good team, he might just be able to jump on the bus. And the monsters they'll be facing in the exam are pretty simple. The D-rank monster, sea monster, he felt uneasy when he first saw it in the game, and meeting a half-fish creature in real life is already making him feel sick. It would be better if there was a mermaid in this place. It would be more pleasant for his eyes. He said that his nose would definitely not bleed. He continued walking down the street and thought that mermaids have always been related to demons, and a demon is a very supernatural creature. If he compares it to demons, monsters are the level of first graders. Fortunately, he only has monsters in the exam, and they won't be meeting demons. He sat down on the bench silently, and after a while, he said that it's been a month since he came to this academy. It's so quiet there at night. He looked at the sky and thought about peace. He also thought that 700 years had passed since the peace between demons and humans. There, as in the history of ordinary humanity, despite the official agreement, small conflicts still occurred. The main reason was Bahman. Half a century ago, the 6th Legion commander crossed the border on his own. They declared that they had revived the sealed first commander. He then shouted that he would definitely bring back Lord Raikan. At that moment, Bahman began to break the seal with his fist and attack this team. Young Siegfried tried to hold back his pressure. The media then worriedly shouted his name. The protagonist thought that humanity had put up the strongest hero for battle, the hero of the 7 stars. And after a week of bloody battle, they won, but at the cost of 3 people's lives. Fortunately, now both sides are determined to avoid a repeat of the conflict. He remembered sitting in the toilet with a phone in his hands and said that although the people there won, but it was only the commander of the 6th Legion. At the moment, he thought that the world was still going on. He was still looking at the sky and said that in some way, that was why he was currently living in a quiet time. He thought that the more he thought about it, the more he wondered. How was Valor able to seal Raikan all by himself? He looked at his phone questioningly and asked if he was not human. He started scrolling through the years on the calendar with quick movements of his fingers and thought that there were only 3 years left until the next demon war that would destroy the current world. But even if he tried to come up with a plan to prevent the disaster now, it would not change anything. So he had better focus on the exams. Of course, it irritated him terribly, but first, he needed to choose allies. He looked at his contacts on his phone and thought, was he really living that quietly? He didn't have any friends at all. And if he thought about it, he was one of the most famous people in the academy now. If he uses this trump card, he can put together a good team, right? Then he can live in peace and quiet for the next 3 years. He flipped through the apps on his phone and said with a smile that now he needs to give all his strength to pass the exams well. He needs to live not quietly, but loudly, but peacefully. Now his goal has changed. That's great. About a week later, he was sitting in one of the academy's classrooms. He sat nervously in his seat and kept silent. Then he panicked and thought that this was probably some kind of joke. No one was asking him to join their team. He gave so much in the battle with Nox that it seemed like it was too much. Most likely, everyone decided that it would be impossible to work with him. He slapped his face with his palm and thought that maybe the students were afraid of him now. But suddenly he saw Chloe sitting alone too. He thought that he was not the only one. It seemed that after that day, Chloe also became an outcast. The protagonist approached her and called her by name, after which he asked if she had found a team yet. She was happy to see him and said that she had not yet done so. He asked if she was okay. She had so many friends around her. She happily said that she was fine, especially when he was next to her. He remained silent, but then he said that they should then team up and find 3 more members for the team. Her eyes lit up, so she agreed with him. He thought that he had no doubt in Chloe's strength. If the goal of the exam was to catch as many monsters as possible, and he could wield a knife for as long as 30 seconds, then they would definitely kill more than 100. She began to rejoice and said that she was now very excited. He thought that it seemed to him that she was now much more cheerful. Suddenly, a roar and screams began to be emitted from the audience, which scared Kama very much. Rachel was running towards them, screaming at the top of her voice that she had come to have fun. He was very surprised by this and asked her why she had come there again. She asked, why couldn't she just chat with them? At that moment, Chloe picked up a box cutter, and her eyes were filled with madness. She was muttering under her breath that she would finish her off. Kama became nervous and told her irritably that she should just go away, that he was very busy and didn't have time for her. Rachel started crying and screamed that he was so cruel to her. She called him by an affectionate nickname. He was confused and told her not to call him that anymore. She stretched and said in a calm voice that she knew nothing and heard nothing. She continued to repeat this and plopped down at the table facing him. The protagonist did not expect such an action from her, which is why he recoiled. Rachel leaned her elbows on his table and asked, looking into his eyes, he had already decided which team he would go to the exam with, hadn't he? He thought irritably that she was not listening to him at all. He sternly told her that the team had not yet been assembled. She was very happy about this, and said with shining eyes that then he had to go to their team. Rachel touched his chin. Kama removed her hand with a serious face and asked, "Why him?" Yes, there was a whole line lining up for their team. She said with a smile on her face that they were boring, but it would definitely be more fun with him. The protagonist said with a serious face that he was already on a team with Chloe. Rachel made a hand gesture and said with a smile that it was good, they had exactly 2 empty seats. Kama thought that he was afraid that without her help, not only would they not get the award, but their GPA would also be in jeopardy. Even if she was annoying, it was not worth hating a person because of that. He looked at Chloe, who was sitting behind them, and said that they were in business. Rachel took out her phone and said with a smile that they should not do anything stupid. The protagonist asked with a serious face who was their boss. She, looking at the phone, asked that their boss's name was Leon. Had he heard of him? Kama thought with a dissatisfied face that he had really sinned that much in his past life. After all, he had done nothing but cut fish for 30 years in a row, but he ended up on a team with real heroines. Although he had already attracted everyone's attention, and besides he himself was enjoying this spectacle. But he had to stop because with Leon everything changes, because he is the main character of this game. He doesn't know how the system will behave now, but he will definitely have to take responsibility for this choice. He needs to find out if it is possible to change the team before Rachel finds him on these lists. However, she said that she has already officially added him to the team. The protagonist with very strong aggression thought that this is the first time he wants to run away from a girl so much. Chloe came up to him and with a strange smile asked what happened to him. She smiled and said that since that blonde girl came up to him, he has become somehow gloomy. Kama said that he just feels a little uncomfortable that they will be on the same team with the guys from the star class. Chloe said with admiration that she is sure that he is much stronger than all of them, without a doubt. The protagonist thanked her and thought that this is true. He has already decided to be with Chloe. If he were alone, it would be very irresponsible. Besides, not everyone in this group is high level, so the situation may well be good for him. He needs to think positively. The protagonist called out to her and asked with a serious face that what time they were told to meet the team. Chloe said that according to the blonde girl, they need to be at the cafe at 6 o'clock. Kama said that apparently they agreed to call Rachel the blonde. He asked with a smile on his face that it was already time, maybe they should go. Chloe happily agreed and they headed to the cafe. After some time, they arrived at the cafe. Chloe, sitting at the table, is drinking an avocado smoothie and enjoying the taste. Kama was surprised to think that this green liquid costs 50,000 won, well, the prices in this cafe. He took a sip and suddenly choked, not expecting the taste of his drink. He thought with an excited face that he should hold on and not show it. The only thing that cost no more than 10,000 won was espresso, but it was too bitter to drink. Since this place was outside the academy, even the student discount didn't work, so he couldn't come here often. Suddenly, a notification came to the protagonist's phone. Kama picked up the phone and saw that Rachel had texted him saying where were they, she couldn't see him. The protagonist replied that it had been 5 minutes, where were they? Rachel wrote an apology and said that it was hard for her to gather the guys. Kama wrote that they were at a coffee shop, waiting for them. Suddenly, they entered the cafe and Rachel apologized for being late. She asked why they had been waiting for them for so long. The protagonist and Leon made eye contact, when suddenly he noticed Speed and wondered if he was a bandit. Leon extended his hand and said that it was nice to meet him. Kama shook his hand and said his name. Leon said that he had really impressed him in that battle a couple of days ago. He was glad that he was on their team. The main character thought about how he spoke so smoothly, and with such a beautiful voice. And this was the main character he was playing for. They sat down at the table and Leon asked if maybe they should introduce themselves first. Rachel shouted out that she agreed with his suggestion. Leon, with a smile on his face, said that since he was the boss, he would start. He said his name and said that it so happened that he was the captain of the team. He hoped for their cooperation during the exams. Kama, watching him, thought that he had a very handsome appearance. Life was unfair. Rachel, covering her smile with her hand, said that everyone already knew her, so she would miss the performance. Speed, with a serious face, said his name and said that he liked heroes. The main character thought, what was all this? Somehow he told little about himself, pretending to be cool. After his phrase about heroes, his first impression of him began to collapse. Chloe, with an excited face, said her name. Rachel whispered with a sly smile that the main character belongs to her. Chloe got very angry, but immediately calmed down and said that she and Kama decided to join them together. She hoped for their cooperation. Leon kept silent with a smile on his face. Rachel said that it was restraint. And Speed with a sad face said that it was a usual introduction. Kama introduced himself and said that he was from the same class as Chloe. Leon took out a laptop and said that it was time for them to get started. A hologram appeared from the laptop screen and he said that today during lunch the professor shared a file with them. It is a map of Skopje Island, where their exam will be held. On the day of the exam, they will get to this island through a special gate, but only the gate is a subspace. The place itself is quite real. Therefore, let them not forget that they can actually suffer from monster attacks. Leon brought the hologram closer and said that they need to take a closer look. Markers appeared on the map and he said that they were assigned the northeastern region. They and 2 other groups would go there to hunt monsters. The group that killed the most monsters would be in the lead. He closed the laptop and asked if they had any questions. Speed raised his hand and asked that since it was an island, there would probably be mermaids on it. Were there any threats there? Leon said that the teachers would prepare the area specifically for the exam, so they didn't have to worry about that. Chloe asked if they would have to fight other participants on their territory. Leon said with a serious face that this exam was aimed at teaching them to work as a team and defeat monsters. He believed that battles between teams were possible. Did he answer her question? Kama looked at Chloe and wondered if she was worried about the others. Leon said that that was it for today. Everyone would study for the exam on their own, and they would meet again tomorrow to discuss their positions. Rachel screamed that it was finally the end. They need to go eat something tasty, quickly. Left alone with Leon, the protagonist thought, how did it happen that they were left alone? It became too awkward. It was time for him to leave. The protagonist stood up, when suddenly Leon called out to him. He asked him where he was from? He looked at him and thought with a serious face that it seemed to him that he had heard this question before. A question that was fundamentally different from the one before. It was difficult to understand anything from his eyes. Was he talking about the geographical location? No, then he could have asked this in front of everyone at the very beginning. So, he deliberately waited until the others left and they were alone. Leon apologized with a serious face for the suddenness, and said that he had a feeling that they were similar to him. Kama thought that the main language in this game world is Korean. But this does not mean that there is no division into nations here. And yet, you can immediately tell that he is Korean. Leon said with a serious face that they should pretend that this conversation never happened. He stood up and, leaving, said goodbye to the main character. Suddenly, Kama put his hand on his shoulder and asked where he was from. The main character thought that he asked this automatically, but if he just let him go now, he would not sleep all night. Leon took his hand and with a smile on his face said that he was from Germany. After these words, he left. Kama asked in bewilderment, what happened to him? After some time, sitting at the table, the main character thought that for a second it seemed to him that he also arrived here from another world. He could not even think about anything else. You cannot be sure that he was the only one in the game. Besides, Leon is the main character, that's his advantage, and he's just a supporting character. He looked at the bowl of rice and said that in a state of blessing, his senses become sharper. He should try the blessing of the sword god. The main character pulled a knife out of his holster and used his ability. Suddenly, he saw that Leon belonged to this world. Kama thought with great excitement that this was it again. Just like last time, with strong concentration, he could see the voice. He put his hand to his face and thought that he should think about it and try to get to the bottom of the truth. His head was starting to split. Even the blessing of painlessness was useless. But the Leon he saw today was the essence of the Leon he once played. If he were an ordinary character, he would have behaved differently. Was that blonde guy in the cafe really just asking about his nationality? But that phrase of his, it felt like they were similar. Kama took out his phone and entered a search query into the internet, but the browser said that the article about Leon did not exist. He thought that there is no information about him in this world. After the exam, he will hardly ever see him. He will think if he still has to work with this guy again. Kama remembered how media said that he was gone for a long time. When will they escape together? He thought with a serious face that there is no need to complicate things. Even in such a situation you need to keep a clear mind. Maybe this is also the influence of the blessing? The protagonist loaded information about his ability. The system window says information about the blessing. Kama thought that the characteristics have increased, although the levels of the spirit and weapon remained the same. Thanks to training, the body's characteristics have increased. He wonders if he gets Murasame, will the characteristics increase? Kama noticed that the system window says that the adaptation level has increased from 2.5 to 6.8%. He wondered what kind of adaptation level is this. It has grown a lot, it will open soon. If you analyze what he did before the battle with his brother and sister, is it somehow related? He does not understand himself, it is too complicated and there is no one to ask. Suddenly in the system window it is written that the activation time is adjusted to match the minimum number of blessing applications. Activation time is 30 to 40 seconds, the waiting time for reuse is 12 hours. Kama asked with great surprise, 40 seconds, are you serious? He remembered his battles and thought that it was worth it. The protagonist with a smile on his face took a knife in his hand, laughed, and said that his mood had improved. For 5 days, Kama trained hard to improve his physical characteristics. On the last day of training, he made a lightning dash forward and cut a drop of water. The next day, all the participants gathered in the arena. The day of the midterm exam. The protagonist approached the portal and said that the subspace gate was different from the battle arena. Suddenly he heard a voice, turned and saw his allies. Rachel asked with a smile on her face that he usually always arrives on time, but today he was late? Rachel is the main leader. Leon with a smile on his face told him to go to them. Leon is the leader. Support speed. Chloe shouted to the protagonist with a smile on her face, good morning. Sub DPS Chloe. The protagonist apologized and said that he was late. The rear guard is Kama. He looked at the weapons of his allies and wondered that Rachel has an S-class spear, Banchingwajek. Leon doesn't have his Ba-Mung sword yet? Did he bring some light weapons? Kama looked at Speed's weapon and wondered that it is a flute. Rachel came up to him and whispered that even though it looks like that, it is one of the few S-class healing items. Kama was puzzled to think that in the game itself such a weapon is rare, even if you put money into the account, but if it is so effective, then why in this form? He approached Speed and began to examine his weapon in surprise. Suddenly the inspector said that the midterm exam for freshmen was starting, the first half of 2034. Judging by their faces, everyone is ready, everyone knows the rules, so it will be brief. If they understand that it has become too dangerous, let them run. And let them not forget that they are not heroes yet, but students, so there is no point in exposing themselves to danger for the sake of grades. And also, in case of injuries, let them be sure to contact their healer. Leon said that it looks like the time has come, they need to prepare. Let them not worry, they just need to give it their all. Kama with a serious face thought that the time has come. He looked at the worried Chloe and asked what's wrong with her. She said that it was probably strange to worry about it now, but she suddenly remembered that there might be mermaids in their area. Kama said that the teachers had taken care of it, so she didn't need to worry. Chloe thought that on the island of Cilicia, where she was born, there were often rumors about encounters with mermaids and the harm they caused. Now they are in a state of truce with the demons, and in reality, it is very difficult to see them outside the dungeons. And yet the rumors do not go away, not to mention the mermaids, who can appear at any moment. The inspector shouted loudly for everyone to take their positions. The loudspeaker said that the subspace gate was open. The protagonist patted Chloe on the head and said that it was time for them to go. She blushed and thought that she didn't need to worry, because the protagonist was nearby, she believed in him. After a while, they entered the portal. Suddenly, Chloe heard the protagonist calling out to her. She wondered why his voice was still calling her. In an instant she woke up and Kama asked, did she come to her senses? She wondered with great bewilderment why she had passed out. Chloe looked at her allies and heard them say that they couldn't contact the teachers because nothing was working, because there was no connection. Suddenly, a mermaid covered in purple magic lines jumped out of the water. Just before the mermaids appeared, Scupili Island. The entire team was lying on the sand and coughing. Leon, with a smile on his face, said that the protagonist seemed to be fine. Kama said that he usually didn't feel sick. He laughed and said that it wasn't that at all. Suddenly, a monster ran out of the bushes and ran towards the sea. The protagonist, perplexed, thought that although he was proud, he felt like a fool. When they got to the designated place, there would already be adults there. Leon said that the monsters they would encounter at the point were not that small. The distribution of points also did not affect the size of the individual. Let them go to where Chloe was scouting. After a while, they approached the place. Chloe jumped from the tree and landed next to the protagonist. He asked that she had reached them by jumping on the trees. She said that was true, that was how they could move stealthily. Leon asked with a smile on his face, what was the situation? Chloe said that there was a cave 500 meters from here. After a while, they approached the entrance to the cave. From inside, a huge number of eyes of small fish were visible, sitting near the fire. Rachel asked with a dissatisfied face, that there were about 50 to 60 of them? Kama thought with a serious face that if they caught them, they would certainly take first place in the exam, but it was also important to think about the safety of the team members. After all, if someone got hurt in the cave, it would be difficult to contact the teachers. Should they take the risk or pass by and find another place? What will their commander decide? He remembered that Leon said that when they arrived on the island, Chloe would scout the area. Speed would be in charge of the team's defense and buffs. Kama said that he couldn't believe that he was being assigned such a task. Speed exclaimed with a displeased face that it was a hero's duty to help others. Leon said that Kama would have to be in charge of their rear. He would take the lead and lead them. There was no time to waste. If it came to a fight, he would definitely join the battle. Rachel asked what she should do. Leon said with a smile on his face. At this point, Kama was thinking that he had made a decision. Leon called out to Rachel and she threw her weapon into the cave with lightning speed. Suddenly, a loud explosion was heard and she, stunning the fish, jumped into the epicenter of the battle. She grabbed her weapon and chopped off the heads of several monsters. Kama remembered Leon saying that Rachel's job was to destroy everything. After killing the monsters, she stood up proudly, holding a spear in her hands. After a while, Speed began to use his weapon. At this time, Rachel continued to destroy all the opponents, while keeping count. She shouted to Speed that she thanked him for protecting her. She continued to destroy all the monsters and count them. The protagonist, watching what was happening, was very delighted. Chloe nervously saw Kama's reaction and, taking out her sword, used the blessing of the cat. In an instant, she attacked and destroyed 8 opponents. Suddenly, 2 monsters jumped out at her, but she cut them down with lightning speed. After a while, Chloe and Rachel ran at each other, cutting down all the monsters in their path. Kama wondered why they didn't stop. They approached each other, when suddenly a huge monster appeared. Rachel and Chloe swung their weapons and cut this monster down in a flash. She said with a smile on her face that she had become faster. Chloe with a dissatisfied face said that this monster was hers. Rachel grinned and said that she made her laugh. Kama exhaled excitedly, because he thought they would fight. Leon with a smile on his face asked that he was worried about them. The protagonist said that a little yes. After a while, Rachel shouted that 60 monsters were defeated. Leon said that they were on the same team, so they should trust each other. He turned to the protagonist and asked what they were going to do next. Kama agreed and thought that determination and leadership, responsibility for the lives of the team. There is no place for rivalry here. Now he understood what it meant from this world. Apparently, he was just asking about nationality then, or did he want to? Suddenly, Leon was attacked from behind and successfully struck. The team members turned around in the direction of the attack and saw a mermaid. Rachel asked with an aggressive face, where did the mermaid come from? Speed asked with a scared face, didn't they tell them that they were taken care of? Is this a dream? Kama thought with a shocked face that he only thought that everything was too good. In this situation, you need to make a choice: run or fight. If you just run away with the wounded Leon, then it is not a fact that they will succeed. Rachel shouted for Speed to contact the teachers and say that there is a mermaid here. He nervously shouted that he can't. Kama smiled nervously and thought that in such a case, people panic. It seems that only he retained his sobriety of mind. The main character shouted at Rachel to not let the sea monsters get closer, no matter what. She screamed nervously and understood his order. Kama told Speed to help Leon come to his senses at this time. He called out to Chloe and told her to get out of here and establish contact with the teacher. With Leon wounded, it is impossible for everyone to escape together. Let her hurry up while they are not fighting yet. Chloe said with great excitement that she understood his order. After some time, she ran away to another place. Rachel called out to the protagonist and asked what they should do. Does he have a plan? Kama turned away from them and said that he leaves the sea monsters to them. She asked in bewilderment, what was he thinking? The protagonist with a serious face said that for a long time he hated small fish. They never had a taste for him. His specialty is large fish. Kama with a confident smile took his knife out of the holster and looked at the mermaid.